Robb Stark stood by the long window of the Great Keep in Riverrun, staring out at the slow-flowing waters of the Red Fork. The sun hung low behind the castle walls, stretching the shadows of armed sentries across the courtyard below. His reflection in the glass was that of a young man already wearied by the burdens of war. He had left Winterfell as a boy of 15, all puppyish hope and untarnished honor, only to plunge into the quagmire of death, betrayal, and uncertain allegiances. Yet in that moment of introspection, a new scheme churned in his mind, a ripple of hope on the otherwise still waters of his grief and anger. At its heart was Jon Snow, his half-brother, the man he'd grown up with as a sibling, though they shared no maternal blood. Or so he had always believed. They were in the thick of a war that tested the family's strength to its limits. The War of the Five Kings had devoured fathers and sons and turned sworn allies into deadly foes. The Freys, the Boltons, even some of the other northern houses had proven themselves faithless, forcing Robb to think far beyond swords and lances. Alliances were the lifeblood of survival in Westeros. Once he had thought marrying a Frey girl would secure a path across the Twins. We all know how that ended, he thought grimly, hand tightening on the windowsill. The humiliating negotiation with Walder Frey still stained him, and worse tragedies might have followed had he not listened to his mother's counsel more carefully. But now, there was a different possibility stirring in his heart, something that might reforge the fractured alliances into something even stronger, a grand union that would meld Stark and Targaryen, ice and fire, into a single indomitable force. It had started as a rumor. Whispers from across the narrow sea trickled in alongside Selzward's talk. A silver-haired queen, Daenerys Targaryen, was rising in Essos, forging a host of unsullied and mercenary companies in her quest to return to Westeros. With 3 dragons at her disposal, if rumor could be believed, she could set the 7 kingdoms ablaze. Some maesters and lords dismissed the stories as fables told by drunken sailors, but Robb had heard too many consistent details from travelers and ravens to discount them entirely. If she truly existed, if she truly commanded dragons, her return would shape the fate of Westeros. And if he reached her before his enemies did, perhaps the North might stand at her side, forging a bond that would reshape the realm. But he was not ignorant. The Targaryen name had long been out of favor in the North, tarnished by Mad King Aerys' atrocities, burnings and torture, the murder of Brandon Stark and Lord Rickard, among countless others. Yet old enmities faded in the face of necessity, and if this Targaryen queen had the strength of spirit to temper the cruelty that had plagued her ancestry, she could be the ally he needed. The key question, however, was how to forge a bond strong enough to unite the battered North with the exiled Targaryen. And that was where Jon came in, the man Robb still called a brother. Jon was no longer a boy in Winterfell's courtyards practicing at archery and swords. Last Robb heard, Jon had gone to the Wall, pledging his life to the Night's Watch. Even so, the vow-bound life of a Watch brother was apparently not so unbreakable as legends claimed. Otherwise, how else could the Lord Commander, once Jeor Mormont, have passed the title onward to men like Jon? If the realm were to be saved, if white ravens from the Citadel heralded long winters and new terrors stirring beyond the Wall, perhaps the 7 themselves would understand a man's oath being bent for the greater good. Robb had heard hints, bare whispers in the wind, spoken in the hush of midnight by his mother's loyal supporters and certain old allies of his late father, that Jon's parentage might not be what everyone had believed. Could it be true that Eddard Stark, the man of unyielding honor, had taken no common tavern girl to his bed, but instead harbored a bigger secret? The notion was shocking, but the pieces clicked in Robb's mind. There were half-remembered comments from the late Maester Luwin, the sorrowful look in Ned's eyes whenever the subject of Jon's mother arose, the knowledge that Ned Stark had not been one to break vows easily. If the truth was that Jon was born of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, then it was a secret so explosive it might shatter half the realm's illusions. Such knowledge would transform Jon, the supposed bastard, into someone with a legitimate Targaryen claim, maybe even stronger than that of Daenerys, if he proved to be Rhaegar's lawful son. Yet perhaps the easiest path, or indeed the only path, would be to unite them, bring the 2 Targaryens under a single cause. Robb hardly knew how Jon would react, let alone Daenerys. But the possibility was shining in his mind like the glimmer of a golden crown. He turned from the window, letting out a long breath as the stone corridor's flickering torches cast dancing shapes along the walls. He had sent out riders earlier that day, men he trusted, to gather every scrap of intelligence about Daenerys Targaryen's movements in Essos as well as the fate of Jon Snow. There was talk that Jon was no longer simply a sworn brother of the Watch. He had risen to leadership, and his name was spoken with respect by both free folk and black brothers alike. That was the man Robb remembered, serious, brave, committed to justice, prepared to make the hard choices. If the gods smiled upon them, Jon would not reject such a proposal outright, though the entire premise seemed more precarious than anything Robb had ever attempted. But he could not yield to fear or caution. The North, battered and bleeding, needed a chance. If forging a marriage pact between Jon Snow, perhaps Targaryen, and the Dragon Queen was a means of freeing them from the chains of war, he would seize it. What do I tell him? Robb wondered. How do I even begin to explain the impetus behind this? How do I force him to break his vows and marry this woman he has never met? The questions gnawed at him. Yet he knew his friend, his brother, deserved the truth. All of it. Even the part about his parentage, if that was indeed more than rumor. This scheme was not about personal gain or kingdom expansion. It was about survival. And if winter truly was on the horizon, if the horrors beyond the wall were as grave as rumors suggested, the realm needed dragons. If the Targaryen could bring them, the North would bring her loyalty and steel. Together, they might stand a chance. He had to try. Days turned into weeks as replies from his writers trickled back. Of Jon, he learned that the young man had indeed ascended to the title of Lord Commander. There were contradictory rumors. Some said he had forsaken his vows and ridden south to claim Winterfell, others that he had died at the hands of mutineers. But those were overshadowed by more reliable accounts that Jon lived, that he was forging alliances of his own beyond the wall, that he had written letters to the great lords of the realm warning of the undead threat. As for Daenerys, the news was slow but consistent. She had liberated cities in Slaver's Bay, apparently refusing to sail for Westeros until she had ended the practice of slavery in the East. More evidence of her character, Robb thought, a dangerous but potentially just queen who might be moved by decency rather than madness if the accounts were accurate. It was enough to encourage him. He drafted the letter to Jon late one night, the wind whistling through the narrow windows of Riverrun Solar. His mother's seat, Catelyn Stark, had once been where she guided him through the labyrinth of war councils. Now that seat was empty. He wrote in a careful hand, explaining that he had urgent matters to discuss concerning the North, the war, and a revelation that touched Jon's very identity. He did not lay out every detail on parchment, old habit from his father's lessons about ravens being intercepted. Instead, he told Jon to come to Riverrun if at all possible, to trust that he had not taken leave of his senses, that what he had to say might alter the fate of the entire realm. He impressed upon Jon that time was of the essence and that he would escort him south personally if that was what it took. When he sealed the letter with wax bearing the dire wolf sigil, his hand shook. He prayed to the old gods that Jon would heed him. The weeks of waiting were agony, filled with the usual war council squabbles, supply shortfalls, and the gnawing sense that the North was teetering on the brink of a final collapse. Every day, Robb expected news of another betrayal or of King's Landing rallying fresh forces to mount a final assault. But at night, in his solitary chambers, he would light a single candle and think of his father, his sisters, of all that had been lost, and wonder if this final gamble might redeem all the sacrifice. The knights and lords around him spoke war day and night, but he was planning for peace, a precarious, carefully negotiated peace, yes, but a peace with the potential to stand against the real nightmares stirring in the far north. It felt surreal, battling half the southern lords while also trying to unite with the Targaryen Queen. For all his youth, Robb bore it with a silent stoicism that belied his years. In those quiet hours, he might almost hear his mother's voice urging him to protect the realm, not simply avenge the North. Then a chill dawn arrived when the horn blasts from Riverrun's gate announced the arrival of guests. The morning sun had just chased away the last shadows when Robb, flanked by gray wind at his side, strode to the courtyard. Snow had begun to fall, a ghostly swirl that wasn't heavy enough to stick yet but enough to remind everyone that winter was indeed coming. The gates opened and riders in black cloaks entered, their mounts steaming in the cold. At their head rode Jon Snow, his dark hair dusted with white flakes. He had matured since Robb had last seen him. Gone was the boy who yearned for acceptance. In his place was a man whose eyes carried both sorrow and resolve. Trailing behind him were a handful of black brothers, along with wildlings who wore furs and hardened expressions. The watchers from the walls stiffened, uncertain how to respond to the presence of free folk in the heart of the Riverlands, but none dared question Robb's orders to grant them safe passage. If Jon trusted them, so would Robb, unless they gave him reason not to. Robb took 3 strides forward, not caring about protocol, and clasped Jon's arm in the old northern way. Jon returned the gesture, gray eyes flashing with a mixture of relief and caution. For a moment, two boys reconnected, almost smiling, but the weight of their experiences made them older, heavier. Only Grey Wind's low whine, tail swishing, acknowledged the bond that lingered between them. The wolf recognized Jon's scent even after all those years. They repaired inside, shedding snow and furs, to a private chamber where wine and bread awaited. For an hour, the two men sat quietly, exchanging fragments of news, each uncertain how to begin the conversation that truly mattered. Jon spoke of the horrors beyond the wall, the whites, the others, the need to rally the realm. Robb spoke of the war and how it had consumed the North's resources and spirit. Both recognized that, in all likelihood, they were fighting the wrong enemies. When the rest of their retinue had been ushered out on Robb's orders, they faced each other in the dim firelight. Jon's brow furrowed as if anticipating a confession. "What could be so urgent, Robb?" Jon asked, voice low. "I've risked more than I dare count riding south. I've left the Watch's affairs in the hands of men I trust, but this war has already undone so much. The dead are on our doorstep. Why am I here?" Robb studied his brother's features, seeing again the quiet intensity that he'd grown up with. Even as children, Jon had been the responsible one, more serious than the rest. "Because I believe there's a way to save the North," Robb said, "and perhaps all of Westeros. But it hinges on you." Jon looked incredulous. "On me? I'm Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and the last thing I have time for is Southern politics." "This is bigger than Southern politics," Robb replied, leaning forward, voice hushed. "You've heard the rumors of Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, across the sea. I'm certain they're true. She has an army, 3 dragons, and claims the Iron Throne by blood." Jon nodded, suspicion layering his gaze. "Yes, I've heard. Why would she ally with us? The Targaryens haven't been friends to House Stark since before we were born." Robb took a breath. This was it. "She might, if we can forge a union. A marriage. Between you and her." The silence was deafening. The logs in the fireplace popped and crackled, filling the room with a pungent, smoky warmth. Jon's face was a mixture of shock and dismay. "A marriage," he echoed, as though tasting the word and finding it foreign. "I have taken vows, Robb. You know that." Robb grasped his brother's wrist, voice urgent. "A vow can be set aside if the very survival of Westeros is at stake. The Night's Watch vow is paramount, but you said it yourself, this war, these old feuds, they're worthless if the living can't unite against the real threat. You need allies. You need the kind of power that can turn the tide." Jon's voice was tight. "And that power is a Targaryen queen with dragons." "It might be. Jon, I've asked you here because there's more. If I can persuade you to do this, it wouldn't be just a political arrangement. It might be your birthright." That was when Jon's expression changed from confusion to something akin to anger. "My birthright? I'm a bastard. The only birthright I've ever had was a mother I never knew and the name Snow." Robb closed his eyes a moment, gathering courage. "We're not certain, but there are those who believe you are no bastard. That you're the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen and my father's sister, Lyanna Stark. That your parents married in secret, or at the very least that you were conceived with her consent. Ned Stark was never the man to break his vows, Jon. He would not have fathered a bastard. He protected you because of the danger you would have been in if Robert Baratheon had known you lived." Jon jerked to his feet, turning away from Robb. He stood facing the fire, breathing hard. For a moment, Robb feared he would storm out, call him a liar. But then Jon spoke, voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "I grew up believing I was no one's son but Ned Stark's. That my mother was some woman my father could not speak of. Now you're telling me that everything might be a lie? That I'm the product of a Targaryen prince and your aunt." Robb stood as well, placing a tentative hand on Jon's shoulder. "I'm sorry. I know it's a lot, and I can't offer you ironclad proof. All I know is what I've heard from those who were closest to our father, from documents and accounts I've managed to piece together. Lyanna Stark died in our father's arms, not from abduction or rape, but from complications in childbirth, if these rumors are to be believed." "Your birth." Jon's silence was long. The flames illuminated the conflict etched in his features. He looked as if he were fighting a battle inside himself. Finally, he turned, eyes red-rimmed with anger or sorrow or both. "So you would have me set aside the vow I've lived by, the vow that has defined my entire life, to marry this Targaryen queen? You want me to call myself a Targaryen? My father's house was the reason your father, our father, was named Warden of the North. Everything we've ever believed, everything we've ever lived for. Am I to just give it all up for the sake of a rumor?" Robb shook his head. "Not a rumor, Jon. Not entirely. There are accounts, letters from men still loyal to House Stark who recall your mother's disappearance during Robert's rebellion. They speak of the Tower of Joy in Dorne. Our father, with 6 companions, went there after the sack of King's Landing. Only 3 of them survived, along with you, though you were but a babe at the time. Ned swore them all to secrecy. Your existence was never meant to be known. Think of what the Baratheon king would have done to you. To father's sister if he had discovered she bore Rhaegar's child. Robert hated the Targaryens, Jon. He would have had you killed. Jon's shoulders slumped, but he kept his voice steady. I know how Robert felt. I also know how he might have felt about me if this is all true. I can't just believe it overnight, Robb. It changes everything. They talked until dawn, a conversation fraught with revelations and arguments and quiet confessions. By the end, Jon was left hollow-eyed, but he had not stormed out of Riverrun. He had not refused the possibility out of hand. Instead, he agreed to remain for a time, to speak with those who claimed to have knowledge of Lyanna and Rhaegar, to read whatever documents Robb had managed to unearth. The wildlings and black brothers who had accompanied him were given lodging. Though some lords bristled at the notion of free folk wandering Riverrun, Robb's command went unquestioned. His stature as king in the north was still recognized by most in the Riverlands, but he knew his power base was not unassailable. He only hoped that a swift resolution to the wars might come from this gamble. In the days that followed, Jon pored over old parchments, talked in hushed tones with the handful of men who had served Eddard Stark for decades, men who had known or suspected the truth. The evidence was circumstantial but persuasive enough that it gnawed at the edges of Jon's certainty. He found it impossible to dismiss. Robb watched the changes in his brother's demeanor, the sleepless nights, the sudden bursts of fierce questioning. It pained him to see Jon so torn, but it was necessary. Jon had spent years defining himself as Ned Stark's bastard, a man of the Watch with no claim, no aspirations beyond defending the realm at the Wall. To learn that his mother might have been a Stark princess, his father the son of the Mad King, was a maelstrom that threatened to upend every stable stone in his psyche. At last, when the moon was high and the cold wind howled against Riverrun's battlements, Jon came to Robb's solar, alone, without the black cloak of the Watch. Robb stood from his seat by the fire, wordlessly offering his brother mulled wine. Jon took it, sipped it as though it might give him courage, and spoke in a voice that was almost inaudible over the wind. If this is true, if I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, it means I have a claim not just on the north, but on the Iron Throne itself. Daenerys might see me as an obstacle, not an ally. Robb nodded. Or she might see you as a partner. My intent is for a marriage that unites the claims, forging a bond so no one can pit Stark and Targaryen against each other. We can end the Southern War in a single stroke if we present a united front. And then we can focus on what truly matters, the threat of the others. Jon let out a humorless laugh. What truly matters indeed. Robb, I'm not sure if I can do this. I don't know this woman. I don't even know if she's the same kind of Targaryen my father was. Rhaegar was said to be noble, but Aerys was mad. I've taken no woman to bed. The Night's Watch vow is my shield. And now that vow may be shackling you, Robb interrupted quietly. I would never ask this of you if I saw another path. You think I want to use you, but it's not that. I'm not forcing you. I'm asking as your brother, and yes, I still consider you my brother, that you say the realm in the only way that might work. Jon bowed his head, the torchlight revealing the tension in his jaw. I've seen the army of the dead. We need every ally we can muster. If the dragons are real, we need them. And if this union can unite the Southern Lords under a single cause, so much the better. But I feel like I'm betraying the Watch. Like I'm betraying our father's memory. Robb stepped forward, placing a hand on Jon's shoulder. Our father's memory? He spent his life protecting you, Jon. He wanted you to live. If this secret is true, he wanted you safe until the right time. And perhaps this is that time. The vow to the Watch was never meant to doom mankind. The Watch was meant to protect the realm. If your vow stands in the way of that, you must consider bending or breaking it for the greater good. The old gods will understand if we succeed in saving thousands, millions of lives. Do you think any god, old or new, would damn you for that? Jon exhaled. Some of my brothers might, but I suspect you're right about the gods. We'll have to see how the realm reacts, though. The Watch claims neutrality in matters of the throne, but if the entire realm collapses, what good is neutrality? Robb's mouth twitched into the faintest of smiles. Exactly. Will you at least consider traveling east with me? We can find Daenerys or send envoys to her. See if she would entertain the idea. We won't force her into anything, but we must reach out. Jon studied the embers in the fire, the flickering glow dancing in his eyes. Then slowly he nodded. I'll go. But I make no promises on the marriage itself until I meet her. And if I sense that she is another tyrant, I won't condemn Westeros to that. I'll find another path, even if it kills me. Relief surged through Robb. He gripped Jon's arm, a gesture of camaraderie. We'll do this together. We'll ask the questions that need asking. And if she is as the rumors suggest, noble, just determined to break the wheel, then perhaps we have a chance. They set off within a fortnight. Robb left Riverrun under the command of several loyal bannermen, instructing them to continue defending the Riverlands from any renewed assaults. He made clear that any of his men who wished to return north were free to do so, but many chose to stay at Riverrun, seeing little purpose in dying on southern fields. Robb brought a modest retinue of knights and guards. Jon brought a small contingent of Black brothers who had pledged their loyalty to him personally, men who saw the bigger picture, though the Watch's official stance remained uncertain. Alongside them came wildling scouts, men and women who wore furs and carried the wild scars of the frozen north. They set out east, aiming to cross the narrow sea at White Harbor or possibly sail from Maidenpool if circumstances demanded. Their journey south from Riverrun was marked by tension, as the war-torn land bristled with broken men, deserters, and scoundrels who preyed on travelers. However, the presence of so many armed warriors, along with Robb's direwolf, Grey Wind, deterred most trouble. Jon found himself uneasy passing through towns that had once revered his father's name. Now they eyed the passing host with caution. He wondered if rumor of their departure might reach King's Landing, but Robb assured him that Cersei Lannister and her court were too embroiled in their own feuds to notice the quiet movements of a modest northern party. At Maidenpool, they secured passage on a Braavosi ship heading to Pentos. The captain, a stooped man with a bushy gray beard, charged a steep fee for the passage of so many armed travelers, and was especially wary of Grey Wind, but relented when Robb revealed a coffer of silver stags. They boarded at dusk, the sails snapping overhead as the sun sank beneath the horizon. Jon lingered at the rail, gazing at the slowly receding shoreline of Westeros. A mix of apprehension and resolve roiled in his gut. Was he truly leaving behind the land he was sworn to protect? Or was he merely traveling to a place from which he could protect it better? He couldn't shake the memory of his oath, but he also couldn't deny that the Night's Watch had no real capacity to handle the threat alone. If forging an alliance with Daenerys Targaryen was the only option, perhaps the gods had chosen him for a purpose. He had to believe that. The Braavosi vessel's crossing was swift and largely uneventful, with only one storm forcing them to batten down hatches and pray they weren't dashed against the rocks of the stepstones. Robb took ill in the tossing seas, spending a miserable night retching over the rails, but Jon fared better, having journeyed by boat once before to Eastwatch. Grey Wind loathed the cramped confines of the ship, pacing at night and whining into the wind. The wildlings, many of whom had never seen anything but the far north, marveled at the endless water. One called it the world's biggest lake, to the amusement of the Braavosi sailors. Jon worried about how these proud free folk would adapt to Essos, but they seemed more fascinated than frightened. After all, they had survived worse. They had survived the Frostfangs and the Whites. At last, they made landfall in Pentos, a city of pink marble palaces and lavish parties hosted by magisters and princes of dubious generosity. The smell of spiced wine and exotic perfumes clashed with the stench of the poor quarters, where fishermen and porters lived in squalor. Robb wasted little time in pleasantries, instead sending out discreet feelers for any information on Daenerys Targaryen's whereabouts. He learned swiftly that she had last been seen ruling in Meereen, having claimed the city as her seat. She was queen of the freedmen there, or so the talk went. Some claimed she had put aside the notion of invading Westeros, content to reign over her conquered cities. Others insisted she was simply gathering strength until her dragons were grown enough to guarantee victory across the narrow sea. Regardless, everyone knew of her. They called her Mysa, Breaker of Chains, the Unburnt, and 100 other titles. That gave Robb a measure of hope. This was not a frivolous pretender, but a woman who inspired loyalty among the oppressed. And so they set out again, traveling by land and sea until they reached Meereen's imposing walls. Their arrival was no stealth mission. Northern banners, black-cloaked Night's Watch brothers, and wildling fur-clad warriors drew stares and whispers wherever they passed. The city was a mosaic of cultures and tongues, people from all across Essos and beyond, many wearing collars to show they had once been slaves or newly freed. A hush fell as the strangers approached the citadel that Daenerys Targaryen called her palace. Robb had to negotiate with the Queen's advisors, who appeared deeply suspicious of such a foreign retinue with unfamiliar banners. Missandei, a graceful and softly spoken translator, received them in a modest audience chamber, flanked by Unsullied with their spears held at the ready. The air was thick with tension. "My queen will see you, but know that if you have come to cause mischief or harm, you will be removed," Missandei warned politely, dark eyes flicking to gray wind. The direwolf's presence was unsettling to many, but the guards did not force him away, not yet. Instead, they led the party through the palace's labyrinth of halls to a chamber with a throne of polished bronze. There, seated upon it with regal poise, was Daenerys Targaryen. Jon's first impression was that her beauty, silver-gold hair, pale skin, a face of almost ethereal symmetry was overshadowed by the air of quiet command she exuded. She wore simple white and gold robes that complemented her hair, a single golden armband shaped like a dragon coiling around her upper arm. Her eyes were a cool blue-violet, assessing them with calm confidence. At her side stood two fearsome men, Ser Barristan Selmy, once of the King's Guard, and Daario Naharis, flamboyant in blue silk. Behind her seat, half hidden in the shadows, were two massive dragons, black and green eyes glimmering. A wave of awe swept through the northern retinue. Jon felt his breath catch, for the creatures were bigger than any living thing he had ever seen, except perhaps the giants north of the wall. But these were beasts of fire, scaled and powerful, exuding a primal menace that shook even the bravest warrior's composure. Daenerys stood as they approached, her posture regal. "I understand you have traveled from Westeros to seek audience with me," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber. "Tell me, who am I addressing, and what is it you want from the Mother of Dragons?" Robb took a small step forward, sweeping into a respectful bow. "Your Grace, I am Robb Stark, King in the North, son of the late Lord Eddard Stark of Winterfell. This is Jon Snow, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and my brother. We come seeking an alliance with you, to unify our forces against the threats that loom over Westeros." At the mention of King in the North, Daario Naharis scoffed quietly, but Ser Barristan's expression was more thoughtful. Daenerys' eyes flicked from Robb to Jon, lingering on Jon as if sensing something about him. She gave a slight nod. "King in the North, Lord Commander. I see you do not come empty-handed, but I have heard that Westeros is rife with war. The Lannisters hold the Iron Throne. The Tyrells stand with them. The Boltons hold the North, if my reports are accurate. How is it you claim kingship in a land seemingly lost to your enemies?" There was a slight edge to her voice, but no immediate hostility. Robb swallowed. "Some of our enemies do hold parts of the North, Your Grace, but they do not hold the hearts of our people. My father was executed by the Lannisters in King's Landing, and the North rose in revolt. Much has happened, betrayals, battles. My power base may be diminished, but I remain the recognized king by many loyal houses. And now we see a greater threat beyond the petty wars of men." Jon stepped forward, ignoring Robb's attempt to hold him back. He squared his shoulders, meeting Daenerys' gaze. "Your Grace, the threat Robb speaks of is the true war, the war against the undead that march from the far north. An army of whites led by the White Walkers or others. We are here to secure your help in fighting them. The living must unite, or we will all perish in the long night." The hush in the chamber grew thicker. Daenerys studied Jon, her gaze intense. "You speak of children's stories told by wet nurses, yet you speak with conviction. I have had many liars and supplicants come through these halls, but you do not sound like them." Ser Barristan regarded Jon with a peculiar expression. "Your name is Snow, you said? Ned Stark's son? I knew your father well. I served in King Aerys' King's Guard and King Robert's as well. You look more like someone else." Daario snorted. "He looks like a Northman to me." Daenerys waved her hand lightly, silencing them. "Truth or not, let us assume these others are real. Why come to me? Why not go to the Lannisters or the Tyrells or any of the other great houses?" Robb answered carefully. "Because you have dragons, Your Grace. The living dragons in all the world. If the old tales are true, the last time the dead threatened the world, it was dragonfire that turned the tide. Besides, the Lannisters seek only to hold the throne. They have no interest in forging an alliance with the North. They would see us all kneel or die." Daenerys listened, her face unreadable. At length, she perched on the edge of her throne, regarding them. "So you wish for me to help you reclaim the North, to fight these others, and in return, what do I gain?" My claim is to the Iron Throne. Will you bend the knee to me, king in the north? Robb did not flinch. I come with a proposal of marriage. Not to me, but to my brother, Jon Snow. He gestured to Jon, who stiffened as though the final card had been played. We believe this union will cement an alliance that will unify the North and all loyal forces behind you, your grace. In return for your promise to help defend Westeros from the threat in the North and to recognize the independence of the North once the threat is dealt with, or to share rule should you prefer another arrangement, Jon Snow would be your consort. A flicker of surprise crossed Daenerys's features, replaced quickly by cool composure. Your brother is a sworn man of the Night's Watch. Such men do not marry, nor do they claim lands or titles. That alone makes this offer questionable. Jon stepped forward again, clearing his throat. His voice did not waver, though tension radiated from him. It's true. I pledged my life to the Watch. But that was before I knew how dire the situation was and before certain truths about my heritage came to light. The words tasted sour, but he forced himself to speak. I have learned that I may be the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, your grace. My mother was Lyanna Stark. The whole throne room seemed to shudder. Even the dragons shifted as if they sensed the importance of that admission. Daenerys rose, eyes wide, for once showing raw emotion. That is impossible, she breathed. My brother Rhaegar died on the Trident, his wife and children murdered by the Lannisters and their allies. I was the last Targaryen, or so I thought. Jon felt his heart hammer in his chest. I believed I was Ned Stark's bastard my entire life. But there are records, testimonies from those who were with him at the Tower of Joy in Dorne that point to another story. Rhaegar and Lyanna, he swallowed. They died, but before they did, they had a child hidden away to protect him from Robert Baratheon's wrath. That child was me. If it is true, then you are my aunt. Gasps scattered around the chamber like falling pebbles. Missandei's face flickered with astonishment while Dario's hand drifted to the hilt of his blade. Ser Barristan closed his eyes as if recalling the past. Daenerys simply stared at Jon, her gaze piercing. If this is so, you are a Targaryen, which makes your claim to the Iron Throne arguably stronger than mine. Why come to me with an offer of marriage rather than simply declare yourself king? Jon's expression turned pained. Because I do not want the throne. I only want to save the realm. I never asked for this heritage. I never dreamed I was anything but a bastard. My loyalty is to the living. To the men and women who will die if the others are not stopped. If this union can unite us, then let it be done. But I will not fight you for a throne I don't even desire. Daenerys studied him, her eyes searching for any hint of deceit. After a long, breathless pause, she descended from her throne. The Unsullied tensed, but she merely approached Jon, her dragons shifting behind her with low, rumbling growls. Standing mere feet from him, she regarded his features closely, his dark hair, the lines of his face, the solemn cast of his eyes. She reached out a hand almost hesitantly as if to touch him, then withdrew. Your eyes, she murmured. They're not Targaryen eyes, but your face. I see a trace of my brother, though I was too young when he died. And you do not lie like men I've known. You speak as though this burden weighs on you, not emboldens you. Jon inclined his head. It does. But I will do whatever is necessary to protect the realm. She returned to her throne, gliding up the steps. A swirl of murmurs filled the chamber as she conferred with Ser Barristan and Missandei. Daario paced, unsettled. The decision was monumental, for it could upend her entire identity. She had always believed herself the last Targaryen, the rightful heir with no rival. Now, a potential nephew stood before her, offering marriage. For long minutes, the hush held. Robb stood at Jon's side, heart pounding, unsure how this would be received. But he trusted that their sincerity would be recognized. At last, Daenerys raised her head. I will consider this proposal. If you are truly the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, then you are my blood. Yet even if you were not, you have done me no harm, and your cause to unite against the undead must be given weight. For now, you and your retinue will be my guests. I will seek proof of your parentage. If it is confirmed, we shall discuss the marriage in earnest. If it is not, I will decide another course. Robb exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Jon only nodded, his shoulders stiff with tension. They had crossed the sea, risked everything, and now stood on the precipice of forging a union no one could have foreseen. It would be days, perhaps weeks, of negotiation and investigation, but the first step was taken. They were not turned away or executed on the spot. That was victory enough for the moment. In the following days, Meereen was abuzz with rumors and speculation. Daenerys summoned maesters and learned men from her retinue to examine any documents Robb and Jon had brought regarding Jon's parentage. Ser Barristan, who had served under King Aerys and Rhaegar, spoke privately with Jon and Robb for hours, recalling the prince's demeanor, his alleged secret marriage to Lyanna, and the hush that followed her death. He was reluctant to confirm anything outright without seeing the official records or hearing from those who were physically present. Yet he admitted that it was not unthinkable. Rhaegar had been rumored to annul his marriage to Elia Martell, though no one alive could confirm it. The puzzle might never be solved beyond doubt, but enough threads began to align that Daenerys grew more receptive. When she was not in council sessions or hearing petitions, Daenerys invited Jon to accompany her on short tours of the city. She showed him the Great Pyramid, the fighting pits she had closed and then reopened under controlled circumstances, the slavers' quarters now transformed into dwellings for freedmen. Jon was ill at ease in the heat, but he admired her determination to bring justice to a place built on cruelty. She questioned him about the others, about the Night's Watch, about what it meant to live in endless cold. In turn, Jon saw her compassion for the oppressed, her fierce protectiveness of her people, traits that reminded him in some odd way of his father Ned. It lessened his fears that she might be a tyrant or a reflection of the Mad King. And each day, the weight of possibility in the air, the possibility that they would wed, pressed down on them. Robb, meanwhile, spent time with her advisors, gauging the strength of her forces. It was considerable. The Unsullied formed an elite corps, disciplined and fierce. The freedmen militias were less experienced but numerous. Allied Sellsword companies like the Second Sons provided cavalry. And, of course, there were the dragons. Robb saw one up close, grazing on the charred remains of a bull outside the city walls. Its black scales shimmered like obsidian, teeth the size of swords. Its roar shook the sand at his feet. In that moment, Robb understood that if Daenerys decided to unleash her wrath on Westeros, few armies could withstand her. Better to have her as an ally than face her as a foe. Yet the question remained, would she accept the marriage, and would it truly unite their claims rather than provoke a power struggle? Jon wrestled with his doubts each night, staring at the star-filled sky from a balcony in the Great Pyramid. He felt drawn to Daenerys' strength, her sense of purpose, and perhaps something else, an undercurrent of shared loneliness. They had both been outcasts in their own ways, both forced into leadership roles at a young age. They both carried burdens, yearned for peace, and found themselves overshadowed by a legacy they did not choose. At common ground sparked a tentative empathy, a small foundation for trust. In time, Daenerys announced to her court that she had weighed the evidence, spoken with Ser Barristan, and found Jon's claims credible enough to treat him as kin. She pronounced him Aegon Targaryen, though Jon himself balked at the name. Still, the court accepted her pronouncement with hushed deference. She also declared that she was indeed considering a marriage pact, on the condition that Jon would not challenge her claim to the throne, that the North would yield to Targaryen overlordship once the undead threat was addressed. This brought tension. Robb had declared the North free. Now Daenerys insisted it remain under her rule if they prevailed. Yet, after long days of negotiations, they struck a compromise. The North would retain a broad autonomy, but it would swear fealty to the Targaryen monarchy, ensuring a united Westeros under a single crown. For Jon, the matter was simpler. He did not desire to rule. If Daenerys was a just queen, he would support her. His only true concern was the safety of the realm. It took weeks of discussion to hammer out the exact terms of the wedding. Missandei drafted official documents in both Westerosi Common Tongue and High Valyrian. The Freedmen's Council expressed some skepticism about allying with outsiders, but Daenerys explained that her true goal was to return to her birthplace, end the tyranny of the Lannisters, and protect her newly freed subjects from any retribution. By the time they were done, the wedding had become more than a mere formality. It was a symbol of a new age, or so Daenerys proclaimed. A union of ice and fire, bridging old feuds and forging a single banner under which all free peoples might rally. Some called it audacious, others called it madness, but it was set in motion. The ceremony was held at dusk in the Great Pyramid, the courtyard draped in crimson and black for House Targaryen, gray and white for House Stark. The air was thick with the scent of strange eastern spices, and 100 flickering torches cast dancing shadows across the walls. Jon wore black and silver, a doublet embroidered with a dire wolf and a 3-headed dragon intertwined. Daenerys wore a flowing gown of white and red, reminiscent of fresh snow touched by flames, her hair piled in intricate braids that showcased her Valyrian heritage. The officiant was a red priestess from Volantis, Melisandre, though she had arrived only days prior, drawn by whispers of a prince who was promised. She spoke words in the common tongue and in the old tongue of her faith, praising the union under the Lord of Light. Robb stood beside Jon as a witness, his expression a mixture of pride and disbelief. Ser Barristan, Missandei, and Tyrion Lannister, who had arrived unexpectedly from another city seeking Daenerys' alliance, watched from behind the bride. Grey Wind lurked at Robb's side, subdued by the sea of unfamiliar scents. The dragons perched on the higher ledges of the pyramid, eyes luminous in the fading light. A hush fell as Jon and Daenerys spoke their vows. Jon's voice was tight with nerves but steady. I, Jon of House Targaryen, once of House Stark, pledge my life and honor to you, Daenerys Stormborn, to stand with you against all enemies, to protect the realm of men, and to serve the cause of justice. Daenerys lifted her chin, her eyes gleaming, a faint softness there for the nephew she was about to wed. I, Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen, first of my name, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, pledge to stand with you, Jon of House Targaryen, to unite our strength and our hearts in defense of the living, to claim what is ours by blood, and to bring a just peace to the realm. Melisandre pronounced them man and wife, and as if on cue, the dragons roared overhead, releasing plumes of fire into the sky. The crowd cheered it. Freedmen, unsullied, Dothraki who had sworn to Daenerys, northern men who had followed Robb, Night's Watch brothers who had chosen to support Jon, wildlings who had never witnessed a wedding of this fashion. The roar echoed through Meereen's streets, mingling with the sound of drums. A new alliance was born. Whether it would be a blessing or a curse, none could say. But it was done. The feasting went long into the night, an odd combination of Westerosi traditions and the revelries of Essos. Dothraki danced around great bonfires. Northern men sang songs of the old days in the great hall, raising tankards of sour ale and sweet mead. Freedmen performed plays reenacting Daenerys' triumph over the slavers. Everywhere one looked, an unlikely melting pot of cultures shared food and stories. Jon and Daenerys presided over it all, side by side, receiving well-wishers and curious petitioners. Tyrion Lannister, ironically enough, provided wry commentary, pointing out half a dozen ways the arrangement might still fail, but conceding that it was the boldest plan he had ever seen. Robb observed from a balcony for a while, content to let Jon and Daenerys bask in the attention. His chest felt tight, though not entirely from worry. He was proud. His father had always taught him that cunning alone was not enough to win a war. One needed honor, alliances forged on mutual trust, and a willingness to make sacrifices. Perhaps this wedding, this alliance, was the greatest gamble yet, but it was also the best hope. Watching Jon, he saw that the gloom in his brother's eyes had eased slightly. Perhaps, amid the swirling chaos of the world, Jon had found purpose, someone to share his burden who understood the weight of impossible expectation. Grey Wind pressed his muzzle against Robb's hand, and Robb absently scratched the direwolf's ears. We'll head home soon, boy, Robb murmured. We'll face the real battle soon enough. Because as joyous as this night was, they all knew what loomed on the horizon. The others would not be stopped by feasts or banners. They would come with the bitter cold of winter, unstoppable as death itself. But perhaps with dragons breathing fire, with the combined might of the North and Targaryen armies, there might be a chance. Robb whispered a silent prayer to the old gods that it would be enough. The next morning found Jon and Daenerys in council with Robb, Tyrion, Missandei, Ser Barristan, and Dario. They pored over maps of Westeros, discussing strategies for an eventual landing. Daenerys' dream of reclaiming the Iron Throne merged now with the urgent reality of sending forces north. The plan was to sail for White Harbor in a few months' time, once provisions were gathered and the entire host could be mobilized. The Dothraki, they decided, would travel by sea in captured slavers' bay galleys, an unprecedented notion that made even Daenerys nervous. Tyrion insisted that the next step should be diplomatic outreach to any houses still loyal to House Stark. In that, Robb saw an opportunity for a swift unification. However, they all agreed that the Lannisters, bolstered by Euron Greyjoy's fleet and the Tyrell alliance, would not stand idle. War was inevitable. But if the real enemy was the army of the dead, they had to hope the southern lords could be made to see sense. Perhaps if they witnessed a dragon, they would tremble and yield, or so Tyrion joked, half seriously. Jon listened intently but offered few words. His mind was already drifting to the threat beyond the wall, the unrelenting march of the Night King's legions. Even a united Westeros might prove too little, too late, if they did not strike swiftly and decisively. but he acknowledged that they needed the unity of the realm before they could face the darkness. Daenerys noticed his reticence and placed a hand on his arm as if to steady him. It was an unspoken gesture of solidarity that did not go unnoticed by the gathered advisors. Over the coming weeks, the newlyweds rode out to the plains around Meereen to oversee dragon flights. Jon saw Daenerys mount Drogon, the largest and most fearsome of her children, and guide him into the sky. His heart beat like a war drum at the sight of such raw power. She encouraged him to approach the other two dragons, Regal and Viserion. At first, they snarled and belched smoke. But eventually, Regal in particular seemed to warm to Jon's presence, sniffing him with a curious huff. Some in the retinue whispered that the dragon recognized his Targaryen blood. Jon, for his part, felt both awe and a strange sense of kinship. If these creatures truly were part of his heritage, he would do his best to earn their trust. He never forgot, though, that they could kill him in an instant if he showed weakness. Perhaps that was a reminder of how precarious his position truly was. Amid training sessions and planning councils, a tentative relationship formed between Jon and Daenerys. Marriage had been thrust upon them for political necessity and strategic advantage, yet they found themselves confiding in each other about the ghosts of their pasts, the men and women they had lost, the faith they put in mentors who had died tragically, the nightmares that haunted them in the dark. In Daenerys, Jon saw a woman who had transcended slavery and exile, forging an identity as a liberator. In Jon, Daenerys saw a man who had faced the realm's darkest terrors and continued to do what was right, even when it brought him no glory. They did not speak of love, not yet, but respect and understanding kindled between them, a spark that might one day become a flame. Robb watched them with a mixture of relief and a twinge of sadness. He thought of Talisa, the wife he had lost in the cruel churn of war, though in this version of events, perhaps she had been spared or lost under different circumstances, memory blurred in the swirl of bloodshed. The point was that war had taken its toll on him as well. If Jon and Daenerys could find even a small measure of happiness amidst this chaos, it would be a victory all its own. As the Exodus preparations accelerated, ships were loaded with grain, weapons, and horses. The Dothraki eyed the vessels with suspicion, but Daenerys reassured them they would cross the sea to find new grasslands, lands ripe for conquest or cooperation, depending on how the Westerosi lords chose to greet her. Missandei coordinated logistics with an efficiency that impressed even Robb. Tyrion penned letters to lords across Westeros, including House Tyrell, House Martell, and even House Lannister, although he doubted his sister Cersei would respond with anything but scorn. Ser Barristan spent hours drilling new recruits, ensuring discipline. The wildlings insisted on taking their reindeer-horned bows and savage spears, proclaiming that they would do their part in the wars to come. Jon was heartened by their willingness, though he knew many northern lords would be uneasy fighting alongside them. At last, the fleet set sail from Meereen's harbor, flags fluttering in the warm sea breeze. Daenerys perched on the prow of the flagship, flanked by her 3 dragons who soared overhead, occasionally diving low to cause waves that rocked the smaller boats. Jon and Robb stood behind her, the wind catching their cloaks. The city of Meereen receded behind them, its great pyramid gleaming in the sun. This was the beginning of the real campaign. The Targaryen Queen and her new husband, the Northern King, the Free Folk, the Night's Watch brothers, the Unsullied, the Dothraki, all of them converging on Westeros as a single tide. History was in the making, a chapter none in the 7 Kingdoms had ever anticipated. Jon's gaze turned westward to the horizon that swallowed the sun. He thought of Winterfell, the cold courtyards where he had once felt so alone. He thought of the wall, the ramparts where the wind cut through a man like a blade. And he thought of the emptiness beyond, where an endless army of the dead was marching, unstoppable and silent. Soon, he told himself, they would face that darkness. But they would face it together with dragonfire and steel, with Stark loyalty and Targaryen might. The union Robb Stark had orchestrated was the key that opened the door to their survival. Standing on that deck, Robb watched his brother and Queen side by side. He felt the deck shift beneath his boots, the tang of salt in the air. He whispered a silent thanks to his father, to the old gods, to anyone who might be listening. For a moment, he allowed himself the dream of a united Westeros, free from the petty wars that had ravaged the land. They would have a far greater war to fight, but if the living stood as one, perhaps even death itself could be turned back. As the dragons roared overhead, spitting fire into the blue sky, Robb couldn't help but smile. He had been called the Young Wolf, King in the North, the son of Ned Stark. And now, perhaps he would be remembered as the man who brought Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen together. The man who dared to believe that ice and fire need not clash, but could merge into a single, brilliant spark that would light the world. With a final glance at the receding coastline of Essos, Robb inhaled the crisp sea breeze and squared his shoulders. Let the Lannisters and their allies tremble. Let the others and their armies of whites come forth. A new age was dawning, and House Stark and House Targaryen would face it side by side. Whatever came next, the North and all of Westeros had its best chance in that union. And so, with the hiss of wind in the sails and the thunder of dragon wings above, they sailed onward into destiny. They sailed for days under a pall of heavy skies and choppy waters, with a wind that flapped the sails like thunderclaps. At times, the dragons soared out of sight to hunt or explore, prompting Jon to watch the horizon with mounting anxiety until they reappeared in a flurry of beating wings. Daenerys reassured him that Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion were well accustomed to the open seas by now, having flown far above the waves on many of her previous voyages. But for Jon, the vast water was still unsettling, a seemingly endless expanse where no living creature, dragon aside, ought to roam freely. He had spent most of his life in the north, its forests and mountains as familiar to him as the lines on his own palm. The sea had always been distant, something the Ironborn prowled or the merchants crossed, not something he had ever expected to master. Yet here he stood, a Targaryen by blood if not by upbringing, and soon he would land in Westeros with an army unlike any the realm had seen in centuries. Robb stood at the prow one morning, cloak snapping in a cold wind that seemed a relic of the north itself, come to greet them. His face had thinned over the course of these trials, and silver threads had begun to appear at his temples, though he was still a young man. War and grief had stripped away his boyishness. Yet in his eyes there was a spark of renewed determination. The marriage alliance had given him a sense of genuine possibility. If any force in the world could break the cycle of war tearing Westeros apart, it might be the union of Stark and Targaryen. Another half-turn of the glass, and Daenerys joined him on the deck. Her silver-blonde hair rippled in the same breeze, and from behind her drifted Tyrion Lannister, looking seasick, one hand pressed to his stomach as if to keep his last meal from betraying him. "We should sight land soon," Daenerys said to Robb, nodding at a flock of gulls circling overhead. "White Harbor is near." Robb inclined his head. "It will be a cautious reception. House Manderly has long been loyal to the Starks, but the Bolton occupation and subsequent upheavals may have sown doubts. The Manderlys are also well aware of the Frey's treachery and the heavy toll the war took on the Riverlands. I'm sure they'll greet us with courtesy, but I don't expect an unguarded welcome, especially when they see dragons." Tyrion gave a thin smile. "So far, my experience with typical Westerosi lords is that they'll happily kneel if you have the bigger army and appear to hold the moral ground. And we, for once, might possess both. When they lay eyes on the Queen's children, they'll know precisely who holds the advantage." Daenerys' expression flickered between confidence and a tempered sense of caution. She had learned in Meereen that fear alone was never enough to win hearts, and that respect had to mingle with mercy. "I want them to see the dragons, yes, but not in a way that suggests we'll reduce their city to ash if they spurn us. We come as liberators, not conquerors." "Liberators," Robb repeated, and that single word caught like a barb in his heart, recalling the times he had marched with the northern banners promising liberation from Lannister rule. Everything had turned to dust after betrayal at the twins in the original telling of that story, yet here he was, older, wiser, and still determined to do right by his people. Wyman Manderly is known for his loyalty to House Stark, even in the face of adversity. If we can persuade him that you, your grace, are a worthy ally, he will open White Harbor to us. Then we can march or sail north to reclaim Winterfell, and from Winterfell we'll prepare to face the threat beyond the wall. Jon joined them at that moment, stepping from the lower deck with the easy stride of a man who had adjusted to life at sea. His cloak was a dark shade of charcoal embroidered with subtle red thread in the shape of a dragon's head. Despite the finery, he still looked more a soldier than a royal consort, sword at his hip, hair tied back in a neat knot. Daenerys' gaze softened as she looked at him, a brief flicker of warmth in the midst of all the planning. Their conversations aboard the ship had grown more personal and private, yet before the men, they wore the mantle of leadership, half Targaryen heirs and half ambassadors to a kingdom in chaos. "Land ahead," Jon said quietly. "The crow's nest has sighted a coastline. We should be at the harbor's mouth by nightfall." Daenerys touched his arm and inclined her head. "Then let us be ready. I will have Grey Worm organize the Unsullied to maintain strict discipline as we disembark. The Dothraki, I fear, will be restless at the mere sight of green fields, but I'll instruct their Khalasar leaders to hold them in check. Tyrion, you'll handle negotiations with any local harbor officials." Robb, you and I should present a united front when we meet Lord Manderly. Jon exhaled. And I'll remain at your side. You are my husband, she said, a note of gentle irony in her voice. We must show the North that this union is not a ploy or a mere rumor. House Stark is bound to House Targaryen by blood and vow. That will matter to them. Jon gave a curt nod. Once he had been the black-cloaked bastard at Winterfell, slipping around corners to avoid Lady Stark's scornful gaze. Now he was returning to the North as a Targaryen prince, or so they called him. He was still uncertain which was more surreal, the existence of whites and White Walkers or his own uncertain claim to the Iron Throne. He wanted neither the throne nor the mantle of royal power, but if it helped him rally the living against the undead, then so be it. He would do his duty. They stayed on deck as the hours passed, each lost in their own reflections, occasionally conferring about the tactics they would use upon arrival. Daenerys suggested using Drogon as a symbol of might, letting him fly overhead but not letting him land in any threatening posture. Robb favored a small, carefully arranged meeting on the docks with the Unsullied forming a protective honor guard. Tyrion pointed out that no matter how they arranged it, the arrival of 3 dragons and a foreign army in White Harbor was going to cause alarm, so they might as well do it with some pomp and ca. By mid-afternoon, the smell of pine and damp earth wafted on the sea breeze, a welcome reprieve from the relentless heat they had known in Essos. The water turned a murkier greenish-gray, and gulls screeched in swirling patterns. Toward sunset, the coastline came into clear view. The harbor was vast, ringed by tall, pale stone walls and studded with watchtowers. The main gate's banner displayed a white merman on a teal field, House Manderly's sigil. Even from afar, Robb could see the bustle of the port. Small fishing vessels scuttling out of the main channel, warships with Manderly colors forming a line to intercept them if need be. The gates of the city yawned open, and tiny silhouettes of crossbowmen dotted the parapets. No welcoming fanfare, but no immediate sign of aggression, either. Wyman Manderly was likely well aware that an attacking force wouldn't announce itself with such open sails and clarion horns. Daenerys called over Grey Worm, speaking to him in a low voice. He relayed her instructions to the ranks of Unsullied on the lower decks. They would disembark in precise columns, the rest of the army to follow at intervals, so as not to flood the docks in chaos. The Dothraki aboard the ships had grown weary of confinement, but Daenerys had set forth strict orders that any rider who caused trouble in White Harbor would face her wrath and that of her dragons. Tyrion half-joked that the city might prefer a bit of trouble to prove the Dothraki were mortal men, not devils from across the sea. But no one laughed. Too much depended on a smooth entrance. As the leading ships glided toward the docks, the watchers on the ramparts must have spied the silhouettes of the 3 dragons circling overhead, because an uneasy ripple traveled through the assembled defenders. Robb saw men point skyward. The clang of alarm bells reached their ears, though it did not seem to escalate into a full-scale alarm. Likely, the Manderlys were uncertain how to respond to dragons that neither attacked nor vanished. The flagship eased into the pier, ropes flung to dockhands who looked on with wide-eyed curiosity. The air was cold enough that Jon felt it bite at his cheeks, reminiscent of the north he had left behind. He stood by Daenerys, who wore thick white fur over her usual garments. Her hair was bound in an intricate pattern of braids and silver ornaments shaped like dragons. She looked regal, but also faintly anxious. Jon too felt the tension coil in his gut. This was their first impression. The gangplank thudded onto the dock, and Grey Worm led a line of Unsullied down, ranks of spears and shields forming a corridor for their queen and her companions to walk through. Robb went first, holding his head high. Grey Wind, who had endured the voyage with stoic discomfort, padded alongside him, hackles only slightly raised at the unfamiliar sense of the harbor. Jon and Daenerys followed, flanked by Tyrion and Missandei, then the Black Brothers who had come with Jon, and a handful of wildling scouts dressed in subdued furs, uncertain what to make of the tall stone city. Lord Wyman Manderly himself awaited them, surrounded by dozens of armed men. He was a large man, broad in stomach and jowls, with a double chin like a bullfrog. He wore a grand cloak lined with fur and a thick chain of silverfish around his neck. At his side stood his son, Ser Wylis, and several knights displaying merman insignias. Behind them, archers and crossbowmen stood at the ready, though their weapons were not raised. The tension pressed on the chilly air like a weighted net. Robb halted at a respectful distance, Grey Wind sniffing at the boards. "Lord Wyman," he said, voice carrying over the hushed watchers. It gladdens me to see you standing strong in White Harbor. I come as Robb Stark, king in the north, returned to reclaim what was taken from us by treachery. And I bring allies who wish only for the north's safety and for the realm to stand together." A murmur rustled through the crowd, but Lord Wyman stepped forward, bowing with surprising grace for a man of his girth. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Robb, though his eyes flicked warily to Daenerys. "Winterfell's rightful heir was always dear to me. I had feared you lost in the southern battles. It does my old heart good to see you alive. White Harbor was forced to accept a Bolton presence for a time, but I assure you that acceptance was never more than a flimsy veneer. Our hearts have always belonged to the Starks." "Then you are as loyal as I remember," Robb replied, relief quivering in his chest. "We come in peace, though I know the sight of dragons must be unsettling. Allow me to present Daenerys Targaryen, rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men, breaker of chains, mother of dragons, and my wife," Jon finished, stepping forward, his voice cool and measured. "I was born Jon Snow, but I have learned I am Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. She and I have joined our claims and our causes, not to demand the North's subjugation, but to unite with you in the face of the true threat." Lord Wyman's mouth opened slightly, as if to question such a claim. But he had an old man's caution, and he simply bowed again, deeper this time, to Daenerys. "Welcome, Your Grace. If you are an ally of Robb Stark, you are an ally of House Manderley, provided you do not mean to burn White Harbor to the ground," he added with a note of wry humor, glancing skyward at the dragons. Daenerys inclined her head. "We come to protect it, my lord, not destroy it. My thanks for your hospitality. My dragons are no threat to anyone who does not threaten me or mine." With that, the introductions proceeded more smoothly. Wyman Manderley, though rattled by the news of Jon's supposed parentage, was canny enough not to challenge it on the spot. He seemed more focused on the practical matter of how to house so many warriors, let alone Dothraki who had yet to disembark. Robb gently explained that only a fraction of their numbers would remain inside the city. Most would camp outside the walls, near the open fields along the White Knife River. The presence of thousands upon thousands of foreign soldiers, plus dragons, would not fit neatly into the city's quarters in any case. As the evening gloom settled, torches blazed along the docks. The rest of the fleet began filing into the harbor, braziers on the ships glowing like fallen stars. The clang and clatter of unloading spilled across the piers, while Manderley officials scrambled to keep order. Wyman personally escorted Robb, Daenerys, and Jon through the wide streets to the new castle, a palatial fortress within the city walls. The architecture was distinctly different from the austere strongholds of the north, reflecting House Manderley's southern origins. White marble columns and statues of mermen guarded the gates, and broad courtyards boasted manicured gardens under the cold sky. Lord Wyman apologized that it might seem cramped, but Daenerys assured him it was more than sufficient. In the great hall of the new castle, servants brought hot spiced wine and thick stews. Robb, Daenerys, and Jon sat at a dais table with Lord Wyman and his immediate kin. Tyrion and Missandei joined them, while Grey Worm and the Unsullied stood guard at the hall's periphery. A small group of Manderley bannermen and knights filled the lower tables. The mood was cautious but not unfriendly. Robb allowed himself to relax slightly as the talk turned to the state of the realm. He had half expected a colder reception, but here they were, seated around a table, not a single arrow loosed. Wyman Manderley mopped his brow with a fine cloth. Winterfell is in the hands of the Boltons no longer. Lord Roose was slain some months ago, by his own men, rumor says, or possibly by a group of disgruntled Karstarks. Ramsay Bolton, that bastard whelp, retreated to the Dreadfort, and from what little word we have, he's maintained a tenuous hold there, terrorizing the countryside. Many northern houses remain scattered or leaderless. The Umbers, who can say? The Glovers have locked themselves behind their walls, exhausted from war. It's as if the north has fractured into little enclaves of fear, bracing for the next wave of violence. Robb's face hardened. "I will bring them under one banner again. Any house that bent the knee to the Boltons out of terror or necessity can come back to the fold without punishment, provided they renounce that vile name. But those who continue to support Ramsay's atrocities will be named traitors." Lord Wyman nodded vigorously, relief plain on his face. "I've yet to see a Stark reclaim the seat of Winterfell. With a legitimate Stark in the lead, we might rally the North as a single host again. Though I must say," he paused, his gaze drifting to Daenerys, We've never known a Targaryen to step foot in these cold lands for many a year. Will your presence not trouble some of the older families, your grace?" Daenerys met his eyes levelly. "My father, the Mad King, inflicted great harm on your land, as did the rebel forces that rose against him. I have spent my life trying to break the chains of tyranny, not to forge new ones. I come to safeguard these people against the threat that truly matters, the army of the dead in the far north. You have my word that I will not impose cruelty upon any who stand with us." Lord Wyman glanced at Jon as if searching his face for confirmation. Jon gave a firm nod. "It's true. We face a horror beyond all comprehension, my lord. We must unite, or we will all be whites under the White Walker's command. We have proof if you need it." Wyman held up a hand. "If Robb Stark trusts you, that's enough for me. Though I suspect some of the other lords will require more convincing. They scoff at tales of the dead. But if you bring them dragons breathing fire, perhaps their doubts will vanish." Tyrion, who had been uncharacteristically silent, piped up. "When the time comes, my lord, I plan to gather the lords and show them a captured white, or at least some tangible evidence, if possible. I have a certain experience with winning over skeptics." A faint smirk twitched on his lips. "But in the meantime, might I suggest we confirm immediate next steps? My queen's forces require a place to camp. The Dothraki, in particular, are uneasy within city walls." Wyman and Robb hashed out the logistical details. A broad plain north of the White Knife could serve as a massive encampment, with the river providing water. The local farmers would be compensated for any trampled fields, though Wyman warned that winter was creeping close, so fodder for horses and supplies for men would be scarce. Daenerys assured him they had provisions aboard their fleet, but it would only last so long. Soon they would need to turn their eyes toward Winterfell and beyond. Jon eyed the windows of the hall, half expecting the cold winds of the others to swirl in, but the chill was only the normal bite of early winter. His mind lingered on the wall, on the stories Samwell Tarly had sent by Raven about how the dead were stirring more boldly. They had no time to waste. The next morning, the spectacle of disembarking fully began. One by one, the large transport ships unloaded hundreds of unsullied, thousands of Dothraki horses, supplies, and wagons. The watchers from White Harbor's walls gawked at the swirl of foreign banners, the strange braided warriors galloping in circles, whooping at the north's crisp air. A throng of freedmen who had followed Daenerys to start anew in Westeros gazed around at the looming gray sky and the stark architecture, uncertain if they had traded one harsh land for another. Tyrion oversaw the attempts to keep the peace, guiding local merchants to appropriate stalls where they could sell bread and ale to the newcomers. Now and then, a Dothraki rider got into a heated argument with a Northman over the price of salted fish, but Grey Worm's patrols quickly broke up any trouble. In the city's main square, Daenerys made a brief public address, standing on a hastily constructed wooden platform. She wore her white and red cloak, the wind tugging at her braids. Missandei translated her words into a resounding speech that carried across the throngs. She was there to ally with the North, to stand beside Robb Stark, the king in the North, against all who threatened them, be they living or dead. Robb then spoke of the atrocities inflicted upon the North by the Boltons and the Lannisters, and how a new era beckoned if the North joined with Daenerys Targaryen's formidable strength. Jon stood quietly behind them, feeling the eyes of the crowd dart to him every so often. Word was already spreading that he was some lost Targaryen prince, but he neither confirmed nor denied it here. He only watched for any sign of hostility. After the speeches, a modest cheer arose, more from curiosity and cautious hope than unbridled enthusiasm. Many among the crowd were old fisherfolk or farmers who had lost kin to the wars. They had seen lords and would-be kings come and go. But the sight of dragons wheeling in the skies over the city walls kindled wonder and dread. If nothing else, they realized the times were changing in ways they could scarcely have imagined. Within a week, the massive camp sprang up north of the city. Daenerys established her command tent, a grand structure of striped Essos fabric that contrasted starkly with the rocky northern landscape. The Dothraki erected their own tents in a sprawling formation, and great fires burned each night as they feasted on meat from local ranchers, generously compensated by Tyrion's coffers. The Unsullied maintained a rigid perimeter around both the camp and parts of White Harbor's gates, ensuring no infiltration by spies or saboteurs. The Manderley guards, for their part, kept an uneasy watch as well, uncertain how to handle so many foreign warriors in the domain of the north. Robb and Jon spent hours each day dispatching ravens to the other northern lords, urging them to come to White Harbor or to Winterfell to discuss a grand meeting. Some replied with polite acceptance. Others remained silent or, in the case of certain houses rumored to be in disarray, simply unreachable. Over cups of ale in the evenings, the two brothers pored over maps by the light of oil lamps, strategizing their approach. Jon insisted on urgency, pressing that the host should march for Winterfell within a fortnight, but Robb cautioned that they must first secure broader support. The White Walkers would be unstoppable if the realm remained fragmented. One snowy morning, Daenerys arranged a gathering of her closest advisors: Robb, Jon, Tyrion, Missandei, Grey Worm, and a few of the wildling leaders who had accompanied Jon, including Tormund Giantbane. They huddled inside the main tent, warmed by a brazier. Daenerys rested her gloved hands on the edge of a large table. "We cannot wait much longer," she said. "The Dothraki are restless, and every day we risk skirmishes with local outlaws or Bolton scouts. If Ramsay Bolton remains at the Dreadfort, he could harass us on our march to Winterfell. And what of the rest of the North's lords? Will they come freely?" Robb nodded gravely. "Most will if they see that White Harbor stands with us. The Manderleys hold great influence. But you're right, Ramsay must be dealt with swiftly. Even a rabid dog can bite our flank if we ignore it." Tormund folded his massive arms. "Send me and my free folk to root him out. We know how to fight in the cold. We'll bring him back in chains or in pieces." Daenerys' gaze flicked to Jon, who spoke next. "It's a tempting idea, but we need to keep the army together to avoid being picked off in smaller detachments. Ramsay may not have the numbers to confront us in the open, but he can wage a guerrilla war. And if we split our forces, we might leave White Harbor vulnerable to sudden attack." Tyrion scratched at his scarred nose. "A direct strike on the Dreadfort might be best. Overwhelm Ramsay before he has time to prepare. Then we march on Winterfell from a secure vantage. Unless you believe we can lure him out." Robb set a hand on the map. "Ramsay's cunning, but he's also arrogant. He might try to ambush us on the road if we broadcast our route. In my experience, lords who rely on terror often overplay their hand. But I'd rather not risk losing men in some hidden ravine. Better to bring dragons overhead. Show him we're done playing games." Daenerys' lips curved in a faint smile. "My dragons are hungry. I can't say I would regret letting them feast on a Bolton." She turned to Grey Worm. "Have the Unsullied scouts gather information about the roads leading to the Dreadfort. We move soon." Within days, the entire host was on the march. Wyman Manderley pledged a portion of his own knights and foot soldiers to join them, swelling the already imposing ranks. The sight was breathtaking. Thousands of Unsullied in perfect formation, Dothraki outriders galloping ahead in search of potential threats, wildlings with their patchwork furs scouting the flanks, and behind them all the supply wagons pulled by long lines of draft horses. Robb rode near the front with Grey Wind loping by his side, the direwolf's breath misting in the icy air. Jon rode alongside Daenerys, who had chosen a pale mare. Above them, Drogon, Regal, and Viserion traced arcs in the sky, occasionally disappearing behind rolling gray clouds. Despite the sense of looming conflict, there was a powerful undercurrent of unity. These people, from opposite ends of the world, marched under two banners now intertwined, the Dragon of House Targaryen and the Direwolf of House Stark. Snow began to fall on the third day of the march. It started as a gentle flurry, but soon the north reminded them of its stern nature, and a biting wind blew across open fields, stirring the drifts. The Dothraki huddled in furs they had traded for, cursing the cold in their own tongue. The Unsullied remained stoic, but their uncovered faces reddened in the harsh wind. Daenerys herself shivered beneath her layers, and Jon remembered a time he might have teased a southern traveler for not knowing the bitterness of the North's kisses. Now he was simply concerned for her well-being, offering suggestions: layered gloves, thicker boots. But even he felt the chill that seeped into the bones. It was only the beginning of winter. How would their armies fare when the true deep freeze set in? On the approach to the Dreadfort, word reached them via outriders that the gates were barred, the battlements manned by archers. No sign of a field army to meet them. Ramsay had apparently decided to hole up behind his walls and test the siege. Robb ordered the host to encamp outside of bow range, intending to cut off any supply lines. The Dothraki, brimming with impatience, clamored for an assault, but Jon and Robb insisted on caution. A direct rush against the Dreadfort's walls, lined with murder holes and archers, would lead to needless deaths. They had other options. At dusk on the second day of the siege, Daenerys and Robb conferred. "If we give Ramsay time, he might strike at our rear or attempt to slip away," Robb said. "But the Dreadfort is formidable. We can't simply starve him out quickly. We have the advantage in numbers, yet that means we require more supplies ourselves." Daenerys' eyes gleamed with the reflection of the campfires. "Then let me end this quickly. I will take Drogon into the sky, perhaps Regal as well, and burn their gates. It will be a show of power that none can ignore. We'll spare as many small folk as we can," but Ramsay and his men chose to remain inside. Jon felt a ripple of unease. He remembered how quickly dragonfire could become indiscriminate. Yet he also acknowledged the wisdom of a swift end. "We should at least give them a chance to surrender," he said. "Some of those men on the walls might be forced to serve Ramsay out of fear." Daenerys agreed. At dawn, she flew Drogon over the ramparts in a slow, menacing sweep. The black dragon's roar caused many defenders to drop their bows in terror, and some fled the battlements entirely. Daenerys' voice, amplified by her nearness, echoed across the fortress yard. "I am Daenerys Targaryen, the unburnt mother of dragons. If you wish to live, lower your arms and open the gates. Ramsay Bolton has 1 hour to surrender. Anyone who remains loyal to him after that will be considered a traitor and face dragonfire." Regal soared in tandem, greenish scales shimmering, exhaling a plume of flame in a show of intimidation. Below, the thousands of troops ringed the fortress, the Dothraki whooping at the spectacle, the Unsullied standing at attention, Robb, Jon, and Grey Wind watching from a small rise. The reply from within the fortress was a single volley of arrows aimed at Drogon. The missiles fell harmlessly away as few archers dared to aim properly while a massive black dragon glared down at them. Still, it was defiance. Daenerys landed Drogon near Robb's position. "They have chosen," she said, voice clipped. "It remains to be seen if they will rethink their folly within the hour." The hour passed in tense anticipation. A handful of men trickled out the gates with hands raised, claiming they had been pressed into service. They were quickly disarmed, questioned, and taken to the rear lines. But no sign of Ramsay or a large surrender came. Finally, as the sun rose higher and the hourglass emptied, Daenerys swung herself onto Drogon's back once more, her posture stiff with resolve. Robb and Jon accompanied the dragon's approach on horseback, with Regal gliding overhead. From the walls, a fresh volley of arrows hissed out, forcing Robb and Jon to pull back. A half-dozen struck Drogon's hide, but the thick scales turned them aside. Roaring furiously, Drogon descended on the barbican, unleashing a torrent of flame that engulfed the sturdy oak gates. In moments, the wood crackled and blackened, gushing smoke. Regal joined in, torching a portion of the battlements where archers cowered. Jon watched, heart pounding. The raw power on display both awed and frightened him. The defenders screamed, scattering from the flames. The gate collapsed in a thunderous crash. A second blast of dragonfire turned the splintered remains into ash. That was the moment Robb signaled the advance. Unsullied columns marched forward in perfect formation, shields locked. Robb galloped beside them with Grey Wind bounding ahead. The Dothraki poured in from the flanks, yipping and brandishing rocks, eager to show their prowess. Jon joined the second wave, leading a group of wildling warriors, their voices raised in savage cries. As they reached the charred gates, Robb saw defenders in disarray, some dropping swords to flee, others trying to muster a stand in the courtyard. The stench of burning flesh and scorched timber stung the air. A grim realization formed in Robb's mind. The cost of swift victory was always high. He prayed fewer innocents were inside than rumored. Inside the walls, the Unsullied made short work of pockets of resistance. Ramsay's men were outnumbered, terrified by the dragons overhead, and battered by the disciplined spear wall. The Dothraki fanned out to chase any who tried to hide in the keep's corridors. Robb dismounted, leading a small group deeper into the fortress. Grey Wind flared his nostrils, sniffing for any sign of the infamous bastard of Bolton. They passed by old stone passages lined with flayed man sigils, the symbol of House Bolton, a ghastly reminder of centuries of cruelty. More than once, they found cells with half-starved captives, presumably men or women who had displeased Ramsay. Robb's men freed them, though some were too weak to walk. Jon caught up to Robb near the old throne room, which was strewn with debris. "No sign of Ramsay yet," Jon said, catching his breath. "Some of the defenders claim he barricaded himself below in the dungeons, or he might be trying to slip out a secret passage." Robb gritted his teeth. "We find him. This ends here. The Boltons have spilled Stark blood for the last time." They descended into the underbelly of the keep, torches casting jittery shadows on damp stone. The corridor reeked of rot, and squeaks of rats echoed. Jon's hand closed around the hilt of Longclaw as they advanced. He recalled Craster's keep beyond the wall, the horror of certain dungeons and the cruelty of men who thrived in darkness. This place was no better. Chains hung from walls, stained with old blood. They checked each cell, stepping over rotting straw. Twice they found shriveled corpses of captives who had died from neglect. Grey Wind stiffened, hackles raised, then let out a low growl. Robb glanced at Jon, and they both picked up their pace. The corridor sloped downward into a small torture chamber. The door was slightly ajar, the faint flicker of a single candle visible. Inside, they found Ramsay Bolton, flanked by two men trembling in their boots. Ramsay himself wore battered leather armor emblazoned with the flayed man. His face twisted into a grin at the sight of them, as though this was some merry reunion. "Well, well," Ramsay purred. "Isn't this a lovely surprise? My old friend Robb Stark, the young wolf, prancing about with foreign whores on dragons. And the bastard of Winterfell, too. I hear you're calling yourself a Targaryen prince now. My, how the world changes." Robb felt Grey Wind shift beside him, baring teeth in a silent snarl. "Your men are routed, Ramsay. The Dreadfort is ours. Surrender if you wish to keep your head." Ramsay laughed, a high-pitched cackle. "My father taught me never to kneel to wolves. Yet I hear he's dead now, lovely. That means I'm the rightful Lord Bolton, does it not? This keep is mine. Shall we dispute that with steel?" Before Robb could respond, the two men behind Ramsay bolted for the door, not wanting any part in a hopeless fight. Jon let them pass, focusing on Ramsay, who seemed fully prepared to die here. "Don't do this," Jon said, voice tight. "We'll give you a trial if you yield. If not, we'll kill you now." Ramsay twitched his lips as if he'd tasted something foul. "You think I fear your trial? I've turned grown men to shuddering wretches with a simple flick of my blade. And you're both just crow food." He hurled a throwing knife. It whistled through the air, but Robb ducked, the blade nicking the wall behind him. Grey Wind launched himself forward with a furious snarl. Ramsay dove aside, quick as a viper, though Grey Wind's jaws snapped shut inches from his leg. In a heartbeat, Jon lunged, Longclaw's Valyrian steel gleaming in the flickering torchlight. Ramsay tried to slash at him with a short, curved dagger, but Jon deftly parried. For a moment, steel rang on steel. Robb drew his own sword, moving in from the flank. Ramsay pivoted, eyes alight with a twisted glee. "Come on, Starks, show me your fury." Grey Wind lunged again, and this time Ramsay managed only a feeble attempt to fend off the dire wolf with his dagger. The beast locked its jaws on Ramsay's forearm, teeth sinking through leather and flesh. Ramsay screamed, an unholy cry echoing off the stone walls. Robb closed in, sword at Ramsay's chest. "Yield," Robb commanded, but Ramsay only spat blood and tried to slash at Grey Wind's snout. Grey Wind twisted, ripping Ramsay's arm open in a grisly spurt. He collapsed, panting in agony, the dagger clattering to the floor. Jon raised Longclaw, but Ramsay was already half-conscious, pinned under Grey Wind. "No, Ramsay stammered, blood frothing on his lips. "I yield." He tried to manage a grin, but it turned into a grimace. Robb stared at the writhing figure, uncertain if the monster truly deserved mercy after so many horrors. He remembered the stories of what Ramsay had done to his captives, flaying and hunting them. The knowledge burned in his gut. Even so, he glanced at Jon, whose face was lined with tension. "Finally," Robb nodded. "We'll see that justice is done. Bind his wounds, but keep him chained." He gestured to a few men from the corridor, who scrambled to comply. Ramsay's shrieks echoed as they extracted Grey Wind's jaws and clamped irons around his remaining intact limb. When they carried him out, leaving a trail of blood, Robb looked to Jon. "He'll face the same justice my father would have given him. Let him stand trial before the lords of the north. If found guilty, the sentence will be death. I'll swing the sword myself." Jon said nothing, but the relief on his face was subtle. He had killed when necessary, executed those who defied the Watch's justice. But something in him balked at an outright butchery of a wounded man, even one as vile as Ramsay. He was not sad to see him in chains. "We'll let the lords decide," he agreed. "But I doubt they'll spare him." Thus ended House Bolton's hold over the Dreadfort. Daenerys arrived shortly thereafter, Drogon's bulk causing men outside to scramble aside. She dismounted in the courtyard, taking in the blackened walls and the scattering of bodies. The survivors knelt to her or to Robb, some silent, some weeping. A few fled altogether, vanishing into the snowy hills. Daenerys's mouth was set in a grim line as she surveyed the devastation. "It's done," she said softly to Robb and Jon. "A quick end, though not a clean one." Robb sighed. "The North has suffered too long under traitors. The quicker we unify, the more lives we spare in the long run." Jon scanned the broken gate, the scurrying soldiers. "We should collect any wounded, see them tended, and He cut off, noticing a group of freed prisoners staggering out. One wore rags, but beneath his matted hair, Jon recognized the face, a man who had once served at Winterfell as a stable hand. The man stared at Jon with hollow eyes, then burst into tears. Jon and Robb rushed forward to support him, hearing broken whispers of how Ramsay had tormented them, forcing them to do unspeakable acts under threat of flaying. The truth was plain: leaving Ramsay alive had allowed unimaginable suffering to continue. Jon felt a renewed sense of urgency about uniting the realm. If men like Ramsay could exist, feeding on chaos and fear, then the White Walkers would find no difficulty in sowing destruction among a divided people. Evil was not limited to the undead. But at least here, they had won a victory. They spent the next few days fortifying the Dreadfort under the banner of House Stark, disposing of the Bolton sigils in bonfires. Some of the wildlings found the fortress's dungeons unnerving, but they helped clear the remains. Ramsay was locked in a guarded cell, too injured to move, spitting curses at anyone who passed by. Robb refused to linger longer than necessary. The cold was worsening by the day, and they needed to press on to Winterfell. Messages were sent to the northern houses, proclaiming that the Boltons were defeated. A wave of cautious optimism rippled across the region, though many lords held back to see what would come of this Targaryen alliance. Finally, the host moved again, leaving a small garrison of trusted men behind at the Dreadfort. The journey to Winterfell took another week, the days shortened by the heavy gray clouds that promised deeper snow. Daenerys flew on Drogon for portions of the trip, scouting ahead with Rhaegal and Viserion. Jon rode near Tormund, who delighted in telling the Queen's retinue about his legendary exploits in the far north, bedding a she-bear, slaying giants, and once drinking enough sour goat's milk to knock over a mammoth. Some of Daenerys's advisors listened with amusement, others with skepticism. Tyrion found Tormund's stories a source of endless questions, prying out details about free folk traditions. When Winterfell's towers finally came into sight, an eerie hush spread through the army. For Robb, it was a homecoming long delayed and weighed down with sorrow. He recalled leaving as a boy, bannermen trailing behind him, hopeful for a swift victory in the south. So much had changed since that day. Most of his companions from then were gone, lost to war or betrayal. Yet here he was, returning at the head of an even larger force, including dragons. Winterfell's walls bore the scars of battles, sections had been burned, others hastily repaired so that old stone mismatched new timbers. The main gate stood open, with a cluster of men wearing the dire wolf sigil waiting inside the yard. Robb spurred his horse forward. The men gathered parted, revealing a tall figure with a weathered face and dark hair salted with gray. Ser Roderick Castle had not survived in some timelines, but here, apparently, that might differ, though the story had not detailed it until now. Or perhaps it was a retainer reminiscent of him. Robb dismounted and the man bowed. "We have awaited you, your grace," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Winterfell is yours." Robb let out a shuddering breath. "I can hardly believe it." He placed a hand on Grey Wind's back, steadying himself. The direwolf sniffed at the courtyard as if recognizing it beneath the sense of war and neglect. "Who holds command here?" "Lord Manderley placed a loyal steward in charge after the Boltons were driven out," the man replied. "Most of us who remain are old servants or locals who refuse to bow to the flayed man. Supplies are low and much of the keep needs repair, but it's home. We're glad you've come." Robb swallowed hard, stepping past him into the courtyard. Memories flashed unbidden. Him and Jon sparring with wooden swords, Sansa chasing Arya around the fountain, Bran climbing walls he shouldn't have, Rickon toddling after him with baby Shaggy Dog, their father's voice calling them to the training yard. All gone or scattered. He heard a strangled noise in his throat but pressed on. He was king now, and these people expected leadership. But that did not mute the ache of ghosts swirling around him. Jon and Daenerys dismounted, following Robb. Jon, too, felt the haunting pull of memory. The stable he used to muck, the walkway where he once heard Catelyn Stark's disapproving footsteps. Now he returned as something else entirely, a Targaryen prince, a husband to Daenerys. It felt impossible to reconcile the boy he had been with the man he was. He saw a stable boy, wide-eyed, bowing at him. The impulse to return the gesture nearly overwhelmed him, but he nodded curtly instead, acknowledging how times had changed. Daenerys ran her gloved fingers along the worn stone of the courtyard walls, surveying the keep with careful attention. "It's smaller than I imagined," she murmured to Jon. "But it has a warmth. The hot springs. Is that the reason?" "Yes," Jon answered, remembering how the hot pools kept Winterfell's walls from freezing solid. "They run through the walls and floors, making it more comfortable in winter." She managed a small smile. "Then I look forward to enjoying their warmth. The cold here is formidable." As if to illustrate her point, a gust of wind whipped snow across the yard. Dothraki warriors groaned and pulled their furs tighter, muttering about this frozen land. Unsullied formed ranks, their spears held with discipline but their faces stony. Tyrion hopped down from his horse and gave a theatrical shiver. "The name Winterfell suddenly makes a great deal of literal sense," he quipped. They spent the next few hours settling into the castle. While Daenerys, Jon, and Robb took chambers in the main keep, most of the army would camp outside Winterfell's walls using wooden palisades and tents. Robb intended to begin immediate repairs on the fortress's damaged portions. Winterfell had to become their stronghold in the north, a seat from which they could plan the defense against the White Walkers. Letters were dispatched to every northern lord urging them to attend a great council at Winterfell. Messengers also rode south, seeking to entice or warn any lords who were still aligned with the crown in King's Landing. Tyrion remained busy drafting correspondences. Daenerys's new banners, intertwined dragon and direwolf, were hoisted over the battlements, snapping in the cold wind. Some nights later, they sat in Winterfell's great hall, a modest feast laid out to welcome the lords who had begun to arrive. The hall still bore scorch marks on the stone columns, and one corner of the vaulted ceiling had been repaired with rough timbers. But there was enough space for the gathering. Robb presided at the high table, flanked by Daenerys and Jon, with Tyrion and Missandei close by. Nearby, Wyman Manderly chuckled happily at the spectacle. A few other lords had ventured forth: Lord Glover, Lord Serwyn, Lord Castle, the new Lord Hornwood. They came with reservations, gazing warily at the foreign visitors. Yet once they saw the black and green shapes of the dragons overhead and heard that Ramsay Bolton lay in chains, their hostility waned, replaced by cautious acceptance. Robb rose from his seat, lifting his cup. "My lords, you have come to Winterfell at last to see House Stark restored. I promise that with your support we will rebuild what was lost. This is Daenerys Targaryen, my ally, and her husband, Jon Targaryen, once known to us as Jon Snow, son of Lyanna Stark. Together, we form a bond that will protect the North." He paused, hearing the murmurs ripple through the audience. Some of these lords had likely raised eyebrows at the notion of Lyanna Stark bearing Rhaegar Targaryen's child. But it was too late to pretend ignorance now. Jon stood before them in a position of authority. Robb pressed on, voice steady. "We face an enemy unlike any we have known. The White Walkers gather beyond the wall. Already I have heard from my brother's sworn men at Castle Black that whites roam the forests, slaying the living. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Ed Tollett, has sent ravens warning that the dead mass in greater numbers each week. If we do not unite, we shall all perish." Daenerys rose next, hands folded in front of her. She spoke of her struggles in Essos, how she had freed the enslaved cities, how she fought tyranny in all its forms, and now turned her gaze to the monstrous threat creeping across the far north. "I know the name Targaryen is not beloved here," she said, meeting the stony eyes of the lords. "But I ask only that you judge me by my actions. My dragons will fight for the living, for the North, for all who oppose the darkness beyond. In return, I ask that you accept me as an ally and trust that I will not abandon you." Her words hung in the cold air. Lord Glover, a stern man with salt and pepper hair, stood. "We remember the Mad King's wrath, your grace. We remember Brandon and Rickard Stark burned alive. Yet I see you wed to Jon Snow, a man we knew as a Stark, a good lad, if quiet. If that union is your bond with the North, then we shall see." My men will join you, for we trust King Robb. But understand, if we sense any betrayal, we will not hesitate to turn on you." Daenerys nodded solemnly. "I would expect nothing less. You have my word, no betrayal will come from me." Wyman Manderley then proposed a toast to the king in the north and to the Dragon Queen. "May their union bring us a dawn free of nightmares." The lords, albeit somewhat stiffly, drank to that. Jon glimpsed some of them eyeing him with confusion. He who was both Stark and Targaryen. Yet no one openly challenged him. Perhaps the memory of dragons scorching the Dreadfort's gates loomed too large, or perhaps they truly accepted that the time for old grudges was over. In either case, the GRE at Hall fell into a measured feast, with quiet conversations replacing boisterous merriment. Afterward, Daenerys, Jon, and Robb gathered in the solar once used by Ned Stark. It was scarcely furnished now, just a table, a few chairs, and a window looking out upon the frosty courtyard. A single brazier glowed, insufficient to warm the entire chamber. Daenerys shivered in her furs, gesturing for Missandei to bring mulled wine. Robb leaned against the table, arms folded. Jon poked at the brazier with an iron rod, stirring the embers. For a while, no one spoke, each lost in private thoughts. Robb finally broke the silence. "We have the beginnings of an alliance in the north. I suspect more lords will come once they hear the Glover line has joined, but a few will still hold out. The Karstarks, maybe the Umbers, though last I heard their situation was complicated." Jon glanced up. "We should send riders to each. Let them know how Stark is back. They might have been forced into submission under the Boltons. With them free, they'll return to the fold." Daenerys listened, then said, "Even with the North united, we face a larger question. What of the South? Tyrion says the Lannisters are entrenched in King's Landing. Cersei sits the throne. If we ignore her, she may invade the north while we fight the undead, or she might form an alliance with Euron Greyjoy to harry our coasts. We cannot defend ourselves on two fronts easily." Robb rubbed his brow. "We were always taught that the true threat came from beyond the wall, but you're right. The Lannisters won't simply stand aside. Tyrion suggested some kind of parley, but with Cersei, the cost might be high. Unless the threat of your dragons cow them." "Cersei is cunning," Daenerys said. "And with the Iron Fleet, she might attempt to starve us, blockading White Harbor while we're preoccupied. We must either come to terms with her or march south. But the dead wait for no one." Jon set the iron rod aside with a sigh. "We must show the whole realm that the others are real. If we could bring a White South, physically show it to Cersei, maybe she'd realize this is bigger than the Iron Throne." Robb barked a short laugh, though not unkindly, as if she'd listen to reason. "Still, we have Tyrion, and he does know his sister. Perhaps we can at least arrange a temporary truce." Daenerys lifted her chin. "Then I'll speak with Tyrion. If there is a chance to avoid a southern war while we handle the real enemy, I must try. But first, let us secure the north fully. That is our immediate task. If the others come while we're scattered, we'll be overrun." So the plan was laid. They would spend the coming weeks shoring up alliances with the northern houses, preparing Winterfell for the possibility of a siege, and sending scouts beyond the wall to ascertain the enemy's movements. Jon burned with urgency to ride north immediately, but Daenerys convinced him that facing the army of the dead without all the north behind them would be folly. They needed every sword, every arrow. The dragons would be crucial, but even Dragonfire could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers of whites if they lacked ground support. In the days that followed, the courtyard of Winterfell bustled with activity. Masons repaired crumbling ramparts, blacksmiths hammered out arrowheads and spear points from what little iron they had left, and knights drilled in formation beside the Unsullied. An odd sight, those swarthy eunuch soldiers side by side with bearded Northmen. The Dothraki roamed the nearby hills, hunting game. Some of them even began to warm to the north, praising the open expanses where a horse could run free. A few had discovered the hot springs and taken delight in the warmth. Tormund Giantsbane struck an unlikely friendship with a Dothraki bloodrider named Kono, who admired Tormund's boastful style and the color of his wild red beard. On a crisp morning, Daenerys ventured down to the Godswood with Jon. It was a place she had heard of in tales, an enclosed grove dominated by an ancient weirwood tree, face carved into its trunk, sap-like tears staining the bark red. Jon had seldom lingered there as a youth, but now he felt a pull. Perhaps it was the memory of his father praying under those branches. A hush fell as they passed beneath the trees, the wind rattling bare branches overhead, scattering bits of frost. The weirwood loomed, its carved face seeming to watch them with solemn eyes. Daenerys clasped Jon's hand. You've spoken of the old gods. Do you truly believe they watch over us? Jon exhaled, seeing his breath on the air. I'm not certain what I believe, but I know my father prayed here. If there's any place in the world that might hold a lingering spirit of him, it's this godwood. Sometimes I feel haunted by the weight of all that's happened. Maybe these trees remember the truth. Maybe they forgive. Daenerys' gaze softened. We do what we must, Jon. If your father were here, I think he would be proud that you're fighting for the realm, for the living. Even if the means are unconventional. Jon managed a faint half-smile. I hope so. I never expected any of this. You, me, dragons, a war to save the world. And now I'm standing in the place where I once watched my siblings at play, except it's quiet. She squeezed his hand. Your world has changed forever. So has mine. Yet here we are, forging a future. Perhaps there is a kind of poetry in that. They stood in silence for a long while, letting the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the courtyard fill the air. Snowflakes drifted down, brushing Daenerys' silver hair. Jon studied her face, noticing how she had adapted, a southern queen or an eastern queen by birth, but now dressed in northern furs, wearing a stern resilience. He lowered his voice. I know we married for the sake of the realm, but he hesitated, searching for the words. I feel a bond with you that goes beyond politics. Daenerys' eyes shimmered in the faint light. I feel it too, she whispered. I never thought to find warmth in a cold land, but you are not cold, Jon. Neither is your brother nor your people, for all that they hide behind glacial stairs. There's a fire in you all, like the dragons. We share that. They might have lingered longer, but duty summoned them. A page arrived, breath fogging in the chill, to tell them that a group of Karstark envoys had arrived at the gates. With one last glance at the weirwood, Daenerys and Jon departed the godwood, ready to face more negotiations and entreaties. Such was their life now, half-lovers, half-rulers, forging alliances to stave off the apocalypse. Over the following weeks, more northern houses bent the knee to Robb and recognized Daenerys as an ally. The Karstarks, the Serwyns, the Glovers, the Tallhearts, some came in person, some sent representatives. The Umbers remained uncertain, rumored to be fractured among various claimants. Even so, each day the power of House Stark and House Targaryen grew. The people of the north began to accept the presence of foreign warriors, though prejudice and tensions still simmered in corners of the castle. Dothraki found themselves brawling in taverns with rowdy Northmen, unsullied patrolled to keep the peace, and wildlings sometimes scorned the kneeling traditions. But a tenuous camaraderie took root, bound by the knowledge that soon they would face an enemy that wanted to kill them all, no matter their origins. Then, one frigid twilight, a raven arrived from the wall. The note was brief and grim. The dead have broken through Eastwatch by the sea. An army of whites marches south along the coast. The watch holds them for now, but cannot hold them for long. Winter is truly here. Signed Ed Talit, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Jon stood in the great hall, reading the letter aloud to Daenerys, Robb, Tyrion, and the lords assembled. A hush settled, colder than the north wind. Even Tyrion, who usually had a quip ready, was silent. Robb's face paled and Daenerys' eyes flickered with an inner fire. This was the moment they had all dreaded and prepared for. Jon's voice was calm, but taut with urgency. We must move north immediately. If they break past Eastwatch, they'll spread across the gift, unstoppable. Robb nodded, slamming a fist on the table. We'll gather our forces, march at once. Winterfell can serve as a rallying point for any who come late, but the main host must ride to meet them. We can't let the watch stand alone. Daenerys' gaze flashed. My dragons and I will fly to Eastwatch. We can burn the whites as they approach. Grey Worm can lead the Unsullied with Robb, while the Dothraki harry the flanks. If we break them in a single decisive strike, we might stem their advance. Tyrion cleared his throat. Bold, your grace. But be mindful that even dragons can be overwhelmed. Make sure you have a clear path of retreat if the whites come in too many numbers. Jon slipped a hand into Daenerys', meeting her eyes. He knew the risk of losing a dragon to the Night King's spear, as legends claimed the others had weapons of ice capable of deadly magic. But time was short and they had no better plan. I'll ride with you, he said. This is my fight as much as yours. And so, the northern host prepared to depart Winterfell, leaving behind a skeleton garrison. The smiths worked late into the night forging dragonglass-tipped weapons from the supply that Jon had managed to transport from Dragonstone thanks to Tyrion's earlier arrangement. The watchers on the walls felt the temperature drop further each passing day, the sun's rays weak and fleeting. By the time the snow reached ankle-deep in the courtyard, the horns sounded, signaling the march. Ranks of Unsullied marched forth once more, banners snapping in a howling wind. Dothraki riders wore heavier furs, struggling to keep their horses fed. Northern knights and foot soldiers marched side by side with wildlings, forging a front that spanned the breadth of the old King's Road. Daenerys led them from the sky, Drogon roaring above the columns of men. Rhaegal and Viserion followed, occasionally vanishing behind swirling snow clouds. Jon rode near Robb on the ground, coordinating with the newly arrived lords. Tormund Giantsbane trudged at the head of a knot of wildlings, cursing the cold but also muttering that the Real Freeze lay beyond the wall. Tyrion traveled in a covered wagon, citing that a southern-born dwarf could scarcely endure the North's gale on horseback. Missandei joined him, her face a mixture of determination and lingering shock at the raw brutality of the North. Grey Worm commanded the Unsullied vanguard. For days, they pushed north, forging through drifts that slowed the wagons. Word reached them via ranger scouts that Eastwatch still held, but the undead were massing, harrying the outer defenses. The free folk who had once settled near the shore had fled westward, many being cut down by white hordes. Each night, the wind wailed across the icy plains, and the men huddled around fires, telling grim tales. Every so often, Jon or Robb received news of a minor skirmish with pockets of whites or the discovery of an abandoned homestead. The reanimated corpses left behind told the story of a creeping horror that advanced relentlessly, never tiring, never stopping. At last, they drew near the eastern coastline. The smell of salt mingled with the crisp tang of ice. Daenerys and her dragons flew ahead, scouting the route, while the main host trailed behind. Near an old ruin that once served as a watchtower, they found the first real battle lines, scores of whites, a swirling mass of corpses in tattered furs and frost-shattered armor, moving in a ragged horde across the tundra. Half a dozen brave rangers formed a final line, weapons quaking in their hands. When Daenerys swooped down, Drogon unleashed a torrent of flame. The entire forward column of whites burst into shrieking cinders, collapsing in heaps. Rhaegal and Viserion soared overhead, searing another flank, clearing a path for the ground troops to charge. Jon and Robb rode at the head of the northern cavalry, brandishing dragonglass spears and swords. The whites came on in a surging wave, heedless of casualties. Arrows peppered their ranks and unsullied spears impaled them. Dothraki outriders galloped along the edges, slicing whites with curved rocks tipped in dragonglass. The snow churned underfoot, stained with blackened ichor. Jon hacked through a cluster of whites that had once been wildlings, their faces contorted in rictus grins. Each blow sent limbs flying, but only a strike to the heart or neck with dragonglass could put them down for good. Robb fought beside him, gray wind tearing at the dead with savage ferocity. The direwolf's jaws snapped a white's arm clean off, and the thing still tried to scramble forward until Jon rammed Longclaw through its torso. From above, Daenerys hammered the whites with dragonfire. Large swathes of the undead army disintegrated into flaming piles. But more stumbled out of the swirling snow as if endless. Every time they burned or cut down a score, another handful crawled forward. The shriek of wind and the moan of the dead created a hellish cacophony. Jon gritted his teeth, determined not to yield an inch. Tormund's wildlings roared, forming a wedge that cut deep into the whites, while the Unsullied braced their shields, forming an impenetrable spear wall. Slowly, the undead began to falter under the sustained assault. Smoke and steam rose from the battlefield. Then, with a final sweep of Drogon's flame, the last cluster of whites collapsed, leaving only twitching limbs in the drifting snow. Silence fell, broken by the ragged panting of men and horses. Jon surveyed the carnage. Scores of corpses lay blackened, some half-embedded in snowdrifts. Many of the living had fallen too, northern knights and free folk who had been dragged down by the undead's relentless claws. Robb wiped sweat from his brow, ignoring the sting in his side where a white's jagged bone had slashed him. Grey wind limped slightly, blood staining his fur, but he still stood, hackles raised. Daenerys circled overhead before landing Drogon in a swirl of snow and ashes. She looked down at the ruin, face pale. "That was just a vanguard," Jon said hoarsely. "The main host must be larger. We need to find Eastwatch." The survivors collected themselves and pressed onward, guided by the battered rangers who had been in retreat. Each man gave Daenerys and Robb a thankful bow, shaken by what they'd witnessed. They traveled another hour before the rocky coastline came into view. Towering above them was the eastern edge of the wall, once a colossal structure of ice, but now partially collapsed, the sea ice jammed at its base. Eastwatch by the sea was not the sturdy castle it once was. Part of the outer wall had fallen under the onslaught of whites, though the fortress still stood in a state of desperate defense. Jon's heart twisted at the sight of the once mighty wall now showing cracks and collapsed sections. The stories had always said the wall would stand forever. But forever had ended. They found Ed Tollett, Lord Commander of the Watch, grimly overseeing a last-ditch defense near the shattered ramparts. A scattered group of Black brothers manned a makeshift barricade of ice blocks and debris. Ed's haggard face lit up when he saw Jon, though the relief was fleeting. They came out of nowhere, thousands of them, Ed said, voice trembling with fatigue. We were overrun at the breach. We fell back here, but we can't hold out much longer. The Night King, he rides a dragon of his own now, an undead beast that breathes cold fire. It's how they shattered part of the wall. Jon felt the blood drain from his face. An undead dragon? He echoed. Gods help us. Ed nodded. Blue flames. It burned the ice like it was tinder. We lost so many. The main horde is still gathering beyond the breach, ready to surge south. Daenerys, dismounting, gripped Jon's arm. She had overheard. He has a dragon? Her eyes blazed with anger and grief. Then we face a threat beyond anything we imagined. Robb joined them, having tended to Grey Wind's wound. We stand together. That's all we can do. We have 3 living dragons. The Night King has 1 white dragon. The living must prevail. Yet even as he spoke, a tremor seemed to pass through him, as though the scale of the battle to come weighed upon his soul. They set up a command post within the battered walls of Eastwatch, reorganizing the surviving Watch brothers into new ranks that would work alongside the Unsullied. Dothraki scouts rode along the coastline to watch for any sign of the undead horde's approach. Tyrion arrived in a wagon, braving the swirling snow, and nearly lost his voice at the sight of the shattered wall. So this is how it begins, he said quietly. An undead dragon. Has the world gone completely mad? Daenerys glared at the broken rampart. We make our stand here, or as far north as we can. We must not let them spread across the gift. If they do, we'll be fighting them in every village from here to Winterfell. Jon turned to Ed. Is there any chance we can seal the breach? The Lord Commander shook his head, eyes red-rimmed. Not in time, Jon. We'd need 1,000 men and 100 years. The wall was built with old magic. Once that was shattered by the white dragon's flame, the break can't be undone so easily. Daenerys took a slow breath. Then we focus on open battle. My dragons will be the spearhead. We'll try to draw out this undead dragon, kill it if we can. If the Night King reveals himself, we end him. The stories say that if we strike down their leader, the whites might collapse. Robb traced a hand over the map. We form a wide semicircle, funnel them toward the coast. The dragons can strafe them from overhead. The Unsullied will hold the center, the Dothraki the flanks, with the Watch and the Northern Knights supporting. Tormund and the Free Folk can conduct raids from the hills. We have to keep them from surrounding us. Tyrion listened, tapping his chin. It sounds as if we're planning an enormous trap at the breach. But are we sure the Night King will come himself? He may sense a trap. Jon's face hardened. From what I've seen, the Night King meets no foes with fear. He is certain of his power. He'll want to break us personally, especially if Daenerys' dragons are here. Daenerys nodded in agreement. Then that is our best chance. If we can isolate him even for a moment, we might strike. Preparations began at once, even though night was falling and the cold deepened. Men stacked timbers coated with pitch, forming lines of pyres. A group of wildlings ventured into the gloom to scout the undead horde, returning wide-eyed with news that thousands upon thousands of whites milled just beyond an icy ridge. In the darkness, their glowing blue eyes flickered like eerie stars. Daenerys had Rhaegal and Viserion rest on the edges of Eastwatch's courtyard, while Drogon perched on a crumbled tower. The dragons hissed at the swirling snow, unsettled by the unnatural chill. Jon spent what might be his last hour of quiet in a dim corner of the fortress, carefully rechecking Longclaw's edge. Daenerys found him there, and they exchanged no words, merely a clasp of hands. In the courtyard, Robb donned his armor piece by piece, eyes distant with memories of other battles that had cost him so much. Then the horns sounded, 3 long blasts echoing across the ice. The watchers on the ramparts shouted warnings. The undead were on the move. An unearthly moaning filled the air, and the ground itself seemed to quake with the tread of countless feet. Torches guttered in the wind. Un's breaths rasped with fear, and somewhere a Dothraki horse kicked and neighed in terror. In the swirling darkness, shapes emerged, a massive, seething host of whites, human corpses, giant whites, even the shambling remains of dead bears and wolves. Their eyes glowed with the same wintry blue, hungry for living flesh. Above them, faintly visible through the storm, a monstrous silhouette soared, the Night King's undead dragon, flesh in tatters, trailing streams of pale fire that glowed ice blue against the night. Jon and Daenerys shared one last look. "We do this together," she whispered, and he nodded, mounting Rhaegal as Daenerys climbed onto Drogon. The dragons spread their wings, launching into the storm. Viserion followed, flanking them in a triad of living flame. The watchers below shouted a ragged cheer. From the battered ramparts, Grey Worm signaled the Unsullied to hold their ground. Robb, astride a hardy northern stallion, brandished the Stark banner. Tormund bellowed a war cry, echoed by Dothraki who brandished their araks. All across Eastwatch, men took up arms, lighting the pyres, ready to hold the line. Jon's breath caught in his throat as Rhaegal surged upward, buffeted by icy gusts. He saw the roiling mass of whites below, stretching on and on. Drogon banked left, torching a wide swath with blazing fire. The undead dragon screeched, answering with a blast of pale flame that carved a ragged line through the ground, freezing and shattering everything it touched. Jon forced Rhaegal to dive, exhaling a stream of hot flame that met the undead dragon's blast in midair. Sparks and steam exploded where they clashed, lighting the night sky like thunderbolts. Over the roar of dragons, Jon caught a glimpse of the Night King astride the undead beast, his expression impassive, blue eyes shining with malevolence. Daenerys urged Drogon into a sharp climb, then dove at the undead dragon from behind, unleashing flame. The Night King spun his mount in a maneuver that defied logic, swiping with an icy spear. Drogon narrowly evaded, the spear tip grazing a wing membrane. Jon's heart thudded as he realized how close they'd come to losing Drogon in a single stroke. Viserion joined, spitting fire at a cluster of whites below, scorching them to cinders. But the true threat was the Night King's mount. If they could slay it, perhaps the tide would turn. Yet it moved with unnatural speed, as though spurred by necromantic power. On the ground, the battle raged. The whites crashed into the unsullied phalanx, hissing and clawing. Spearmen jabbed with dragonglass-tipped weapons, severing limbs and skulls. Dothraki riders swung their araks in sweeping arcs, howling war cries. Robb and Grey Wind tore through the fray, rallying the men whenever the undead threatened to break the line. Giant whites slammed at the fortifications, sending timbers splintering. Archers loosed volley after volley of flaming arrows. Here and there, blue fire from the undead dragon scorched the earth, leaving jagged sheets of black ice. Men screamed, horses shrieked, but the line held, for the moment. It was a swirling maelstrom of snow, flame, and blood. Jon circled overhead, scanning for the Night King. He spotted a flicker of movement near a ridge where the horde was thickest. The undead dragon hovered, jaws parted, as the Night King lifted a second spear of ice. He aimed it at Viserion, who was belching flame at a giant white below. Jon felt panic surge. "Dany!" he shouted, though the wind tore his voice away. Daenerys saw it too, urging Drogon forward to intercept. In a heartbeat, the Night King unleashed the spear. Drogon's fire caught the spear in a burst of steam, deflecting it just enough that it spun off course. Viserion roared, injured by the near miss, but still aloft. That was Jon's opening. He urged Rhaegal into a furious dive, sword clenched. The Night King turned, those cold eyes locking with Jon's. Time seemed to slow. Rhaegal's claws raked the undead dragon's flank, tearing off strips of decayed flesh. The two dragons collided, shrieking, tangling in midair. The Night King was thrown from his saddle, plummeting toward a snowbank. Rhaegal flailed, half entangled with the undead beast, their wings beating each other. Jon clung desperately to the saddle as they careened downward. At the last moment, Rhaegal managed to rip free, slamming into the ground in a shower of snow. Jon was thrown, tumbling through a field of whites. He landed hard, the air driven from his lungs. Dazed, he staggered to his feet, clutching Longclaw. The whites converged, clawing at him. He hacked at them desperately, dispatching 2, then 3, but more closed in. Then a swirl of fur and teeth, Ghost. The albino direwolf, somehow present in this version of events, or perhaps newly returned, tore through the whites, snapping necks and pouncing with savage loyalty. Jon pressed forward, spotting the Night King rising from the snowdrift, unhurt, conjuring an icy sword. No living man could face him alone. Jon's breath rasped, but he advanced, heart pounding. This was it. If he could kill the Night King, the battle might end. Before Jon could reach him, the undead dragon crashed down, battered by Drogon. Daenerys had spied Jon's predicament and guided Drogon into a furious assault on the White Beast. Blue flame and red flame intermingled in a deafening explosion. The ground quaked. Jon shielded his eyes from the blaze. He glimpsed the Night King raising a hand, reanimating fresh corpses around him. Those who had fallen in the first wave now stirred, skeletons rising. A swirl of snow obscured the field. Jon lunged, but a newly risen White seized him from behind. He wrestled free, Longclaw severing the White's skull, then pressed forward, ignoring the agony in his ribs. It was Daenerys who spotted the Night King from atop Drogon, rearing back to unleash a torrent of dragonfire. The flame consumed the Whites near him in a roaring inferno. Jon saw the silhouette of the Night King vanish in the blaze. For a breath, hope surged, but from within the flames, a shape emerged unburned. The Night King strode through the inferno, ice sword gleaming, raising his hand as if to conjure a storm. Drogon roared, diving again, but the Night King hurled a final spear of ice that caught Drogon's flank. The dragon bellowed in pain, faltering. Daenerys clung to the saddle, nearly thrown off. Jon scrambled forward, desperate to intercede. Suddenly, from the swirling chaos, another figure charged, Robb Stark, sword drawn, gray wind at his side. Somehow, Robb had fought his way across the battlefield. Snow clung to his hair, his armor battered, but his eyes burned with defiance. He hurled himself at the Night King, steel meeting ice in a ringing clash. Gray wind leapt for the Night King's arm, but was knocked aside by a backhand blow that sent the dire wolf flying. Robb grimaced in pain, but pressed the attack, each stroke of his sword meeting cold, unyielding strength. The Night King moved like a wraith, parrying easily, though Robb fought with the skill of a man who had survived 100 battles. Jon rushed in to join his brother, swinging Longclaw. The Night King twisted, blocking Robb's slash, then spinning to deflect Jon's blow. For a moment, the two Stark brothers engaged in a frantic flurry of steel, striking from opposite sides. The Night King stepped smoothly, like a dancer on ice, repelling them. At last, Jon feinted high, forcing the Night King to lift his sword. Robb lunged low, driving his blade at the Night King's flank. The icy figure whirled too late. Steel bit into the Night King's side. A scream, like cracking glacier, echoed across the battlefield. The Night King staggered, turning glowing blue eyes on Robb, lifting his hand. Frost crystals swirled. Robb gasped as ice formed over his sword, creeping up his arm. But then Jon swung Longclaw, smashing it into the Night King's back. The Valyrian steel glowed with a faint, ghostly shimmer. With a final shriek that rattled bones, the Night King cracked, shards of ice spiderwebbing across his form. He collapsed into crystalline fragments, dissolving into snow that swirled away on the wind. For a heartbeat, all around them, the Whites froze. Then they collapsed like puppets with cut strings, falling in heaps. An eerie hush settled over the battlefield, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living. Men slowly realized the undead had gone limp. They began to cheer, a cheer half choked with disbelief and relief. Daenerys, leaning on Drogon's saddle, tears shining in her eyes, looked across the field to see the white dragon also slump to the ground, inert now that its master was gone. Grey Worm and the Unsullied straightened. The Dothraki hooped in triumph. Tormund roared victory to the skies. Jon and Robb staggered away from where the Night King had fallen. Robb's arm was still rimed with ice, and Jon helped him break off the brittle frost, each chunk clattering to the ground. They embraced, both panting, and Grey Wind limped over, pressing his nose against Robb's leg. Jon looked at the swirling snow, where nothing remained of the Night King but a faint swirl of white dust. "It's over," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We did it." Robb closed his eyes, relief breaking across his features like a sunrise. "The living still stand," he muttered. "Father, we kept faith." Daenerys circled Drogon low, letting the wounded dragon settle on a relatively clear patch of ground. She dismounted, half stumbling, and made her way to Jon and Robb, relief etched in every line of her face. Jon pulled her into a fierce embrace, feeling the pounding of her heart against his. Around them, the men of the North and Essos mingled, hugging or sinking to their knees in exhaustion. The watchers on Eastwatch's ramparts shouted and hollered, for they could see the Whites had all collapsed. Snow fell gently on the battlefield strewn with corpses both living and dead. The stench of fire and death lingered, but above it all rose a sense of unimaginable victory. Winter had come, and they had faced it, surviving the onslaught of the dead. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Jon gazed at Daenerys, at Robb, at the swirling snow, tears burning in his eyes. He remembered the friends he had lost along the way, Maester Aemon, Jeor Mormont, Grenn, others. He remembered Father Ned, who had taught them all the meaning of honor. If some part of Ned Stark was watching, perhaps he would be proud that his children and his nephew King had stood firm against the greatest threat imaginable. Robb turned, scanning the fallen. "We paid a dear price," he said softly. "So many gone, but we remain. And we will rebuild." Daenerys nodded, swallowing hard. "The realm is safe from the dead, at least. Now we must ensure it does not destroy itself among the living. We'll handle the South. We'll strive for unity." Jon closed his eyes. "We have a chance. That's all I ever wanted. A chance for the living to prevail." As dawn broke, pale sunlight cascaded over the silent field, illuminating the scattered bodies of whites turned to dust and the battered ranks of survivors. Dragons soared overhead, still 3 of them, for Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion remained alive, though wounded. Men lit torches and guided one another back into Eastwatch's broken walls. The army of the dead had been vanquished, their king shattered. The Great War was over. In the days and weeks to come, the living would bury their dead, care for the wounded, and begin the long process of healing. Envoys would travel south to demand or request a cessation of petty squabbles for a new age beckon, one in which Targaryen and Stark stood side by side. The cunning of Tyrion Lannister and the determination of Daenerys, Jon, and Robb would shape whatever came next. But for now, in the quiet hush of Eastwatch by the sea, they savored the dawn. Snow fell, soft and unthreatening, as if the land itself breathed a sigh of relief. Ice and fire had joined to avert the long night, forging a chance at peace after so many years of war. Standing atop a small rise overlooking the field, Robb Stark, king in the north, placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. Jon, known to some as Aegon Targaryen, turned. At Robb's other side stood Daenerys, queen of dragons and breaker of chains, her hair dusted with snow, face streaked with soot and tears. Together, they gazed at the fragile new dawn. The wind that blew through their cloaks was cold, but inside their hearts, something glowed with the warmth of hope. In that silent, shared moment, they realized that the union forged by Robb's bold plan had not only saved the realm from the dead, it had given them the best chance to rebuild a land worthy of the sacrifices made. And that was a beginning no victory could overshadow. The Stark Targaryen stronghold was real and resolute, a bulwark against both the horrors of the night and the treacheries of men, standing firm under the brightening sky.